Hello everyone, I'm the Creep's Cabin. I know you use these videos to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I remember the day starting out so normal that it almost felt impossible something bad could come from it. The air had that heavy, late summer feeling to it, warm but not unbearable, with the faint smell of dry grass hanging around. The kind of day where everything felt lazy and slow, and nothing seemed dangerous. I had gone out in the morning to take care of a few errands, then spent most of the afternoon wasting time, just sitting around at home, not really doing much. By the evening, I felt restless. I wanted to get out of the house, stretch my legs, and clear my head. I told myself I'd just take a short walk, maybe head down the trail by the woods that bordered the edge of town. I set out as the light was fading, the sun already dipping low enough that the sky was turning gold at the edges and darker overhead. I didn't even bring a flashlight at first, which was stupid, but at the time it didn't seem like I'd need one. I figured I'd be back before it got too dark. My phone was in my pocket, but the battery was low, less than 20%, and I didn't want to waste it by using the flashlight on it unless I had to. I didn't expect to be gone long. The trail was familiar. I had walked it plenty of times before. It cut along the back of a few open fields before dipping into the thick line of trees that marked the beginning of the forest. I always thought of that line of trees as the real edge of town, because once you crossed it, you left behind the open sky and easy paths and stepped into a place that felt closed in and unpredictable. I wasn't planning to go deep, just far enough to feel like I was somewhere different, somewhere quiet. When I got into the woods, the air shifted right away. It was cooler, denser. The light fell differently, breaking apart in patches between the branches. The sounds changed too, less of the distant hum of cars and more of the steady noise of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves. At first, it was calming. My steps were steady, crunching lightly over the dirt and scattered leaves, and I breathed slower, letting my head clear. But I didn't turn around when I thought I would. Instead, I kept going, step after step, deeper into the trees. I told myself I'd just walk for a little while longer, then head back, but the trail kept pulling me in. The farther I went, the darker it got, until the shadows under the trees stretched longer and started to blend together. I checked the time on my phone, realized it was later than I thought, and finally told myself I should turn back. That's when I first noticed it. The woods had gone quiet. Not completely, but enough that it felt different. The constant drone of insects had thinned out, leaving little gaps of silence. I stood still for a moment, listening. I told myself I was imagining it, but then I caught the sound. A step. Not mine. It was faint, just the crunch of something pressing into the ground somewhere behind me. I turned, staring back down the path I had walked, but the trees swallowed up the view. I couldn't see anyone. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to pick the sound out again. Nothing came, and I told myself it was probably just an animal. A deer, maybe. A squirrel. Anything. So I started walking again, faster this time. The sound came again, clearer now. Another step. My stomach tightened. I didn't look back right away. I just kept walking, pretending I hadn't noticed, pretending it was nothing. But the noise followed. Every time I shifted my pace, it seemed to echo me. Not perfectly, not in sync, but close enough that I knew it wasn't just coincidence. When I finally turned to look again, I saw movement. Not much, just the shadow of something shifting between the trees, far enough back that I couldn't make out details. My chest tightened, my breathing quickened. For the first time, I wished I had brought a flashlight, wished I had anything to throw light into the shadows and make sense of what I was seeing. I told myself not to run. I remembered once reading that running triggered more attention, whether it was from an animal or a person. So I kept walking, brisk but steady, my ears straining for every sound. The trail suddenly felt too long, too winding. I couldn't see the end of it, couldn't see the line where the woods opened back out into the fields. The following steps grew closer. Not loud, but steady, careful, like whoever it was didn't want me to hear but couldn't help making some noise. My skin prickled all over. I tried to breathe quietly, tried not to let my shoulders shake with how tense I was. I cut off the trail suddenly, stepping into the undergrowth. My shoes sank into the soft dirt and crunched against twigs, much louder than I wanted. I crouched low behind a thick tree trunk, heart hammering so hard I swore it would give me away. For a moment, I couldn't hear anything but my own pulse in my ears. Then I heard it, the steps, slow, steady, following along the trail where I had just been. I held still. My legs started to burn from crouching, but I didn't move. I tried to control my breathing, but it came in short, sharp bursts, shaky no matter how much I pressed my lips together. Then I saw him. A shape at first, then clearer as he passed between two trees where the light still broke through faintly. A man, dressed in dark clothes, moving with a slow confidence, like he knew exactly what he was doing. His head turned slightly as he scanned the trees, and for a split second, I thought his eyes landed right where I was. I froze completely, afraid even to blink. He kept walking, though. Slow, measured steps down the path. My chest felt like it might collapse with the pressure of holding so still. I waited until he passed farther down the trail, then shifted just enough to glance the other way. The way back. The way out. I didn't think. I just moved. Quiet as I could, I pushed through the brush, away from the trail, heading in the direction I thought would take me back toward the edge of the woods. My feet caught on roots, branches scratched at my arms, but I didn't care. All I wanted was distance. Behind me, I heard it again. Movement. Faster this time. He had left the trail. He knew I had too. I broke into a run, every instinct in me screaming to move faster, to get out. The woods felt endless, the trees pressing in tighter with every step. My breath tore in and out of my throat, painful and hot, my chest burning. My foot slipped on a patch of loose dirt, and I went down hard, hands scraping against the ground. I scrambled up, ignoring the sting, forcing myself to keep going. The sounds behind me grew louder. Twigs snapping, leaves crushing. He was closer. Too close. Then finally I saw it. The faint thinning of trees ahead, the faint glow of open space beyond them. The edge of the woods. I pushed myself harder, legs screaming, vision blurring with sweat. I broke through the tree line and stumbled into the field. The sky was darker now, but it was open wide, no longer pressing in on me. I didn't look back. I just kept running, across the grass, toward the faint lights of town in the distance. My lungs burned, my legs threatened to give out, but I didn't stop until I reached the road. I bent over, hands on my knees, gasping, trembling so badly I could barely hold myself up. I turned back once, just once, to look at the woods. The trees stood silent, dark, as if nothing had happened at all. I couldn't see him anymore, but I knew he was there, watching, waiting. Maybe he had turned back into the shadows the moment I broke free, knowing he had been close, knowing he could try again another time. That night, I locked every door and window in my house, checked them twice, then sat awake in the dark, listening to every sound, every creak. My body ached, my mind replayed it all again and again, and I couldn't stop shaking. The woods weren't the same after that. Every time I saw the tree line, even in the daylight, I felt that cold knot in my chest. I stopped walking the trail altogether. And even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of those steady footsteps behind me, the shape moving in the shadows, the feeling of being hunted by someone who wanted me alone, away from anyone else. I survived that night, but only because I ran when I did. If I had waited longer, if I had tried to convince myself it was nothing, if I had hesitated even a little, I don't think I would have made it out of those woods. Not alive. I remember the night so clearly because it still lingers in my head every time I step into the woods. It started as a simple outing, something I had done many times before. I had been restless for weeks, stuck between work and routines, and I decided to head out on a solo camping trip. I wanted silence, fresh air, and space where no one could bother me. The forest had always been a strange place for me, both comforting and intimidating. I liked how it felt away from everything, but I never shook the unease that came with being in a place where you couldn't control anything. I drove out in the late afternoon, the sun already leaning west, the light starting to dull. The road narrowed as I got closer to the area I had chosen, a spot near a clearing that opened into a wide field, with the tree line stretching like a dark wall at the far end. I parked my car off a dirt path, shouldered my pack, and started the short walk to the clearing. My boots sank into the soft ground, and each step brought with it the sound of leaves crunching and twigs breaking. I liked the sound. It was sharp and real, reminding me how far I was from the busy noise of town. When I reached the clearing, I dropped my pack and stood there for a while, just looking around. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and fading blue, and the air was cooler than I expected. The field stretched wide, and the woods loomed just beyond it, dark and thick. I picked a spot near the edge, not too deep into the trees, but not so far into the open that I would feel exposed. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and built a small fire before the last of the light disappeared. By the time the fire was steady, the woods had grown darker, and the night was setting in fast. I cooked a simple meal, ate quietly, and listened to the soft crackle of the flames. Every now and then, I heard rustling out in the field or in the trees, but I told myself it was just small animals moving around. Still, I couldn't help but glance up each time, scanning the shadows for anything bigger. As the fire burned lower, I leaned back against my pack and looked at the ridge that rose up on the far side of the field. The ridge wasn't steep, more of a long slope that stretched across the horizon, but it looked like a black line cutting into the sky. That was when I noticed movement. A shape was walking along the top of the ridge, slow and steady, as if pacing across it. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was distant, too far to make out details, but I could see the way it moved. Upright, human. The stride was smooth, not hurried, not stumbling. Whoever it was didn't stop to look around. They just kept walking straight across the ridge until they disappeared on the other side. For a while, I told myself it wasn't strange. Maybe another camper. Maybe someone from a nearby farm or cabin, though I hadn't seen any on the drive in. But something about the way the figure moved bothered me. There was no hesitation, no pause, no sign of them noticing me. Just a steady, deliberate walk across the ridge in the dark. I tried to shake it off. I fed a few more branches into the fire, sat closer to it, and tried to focus on the warmth. But my eyes kept drifting back to the ridge, waiting to see if the figure would come back. The field seemed so much bigger now, the woods so much darker. The night had settled heavy, and the silence was broken only by the fire and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. When the fire started to die down, I forced myself to gather more wood. I didn't want to go into the woods, but I didn't want to sit there in the dark either. I grabbed a small flashlight and headed toward the trees. The beam of light cut through the dark in a narrow cone, showing the ground, roots, and branches just ahead of me. The deeper I went, the colder it felt. I started picking up dead branches and sticks, trying to keep my hands busy and my mind from drifting. But then I heard it, a sound behind me, heavy breathing, slow, deliberate, and close enough that I felt the hair rise on my neck. I swung the flashlight around, but the beam landed on nothing, just trees and shadows. Still, the sound was there, low and steady, like someone standing just far enough back that I couldn't see them. I held my breath, straining to listen, and I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. Not a full shape, not clear, but a shift of shadow that didn't match the others. The breathing started to fade, moving deeper into the woods. Each exhale seemed more distant, and soon it was gone. I stood there frozen, trying to decide if I should follow it or run back. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, then forced myself to grab the branches I had collected and head quickly back toward camp. When I reached the clearing, I tossed the wood down and stoked the fire until it was blazing again. The light and heat gave me some comfort, but I couldn't shake the unease. I kept replaying the sound in my head. Breathing. Not animal-like, not the fast huff of a deer or the growl of a predator. It was too measured, too human. I sat there until the fire burned low again, eyes darting to the tree line every few seconds. I couldn't relax. Every rustle, every snap in the distance made me tense. At one point, I thought I saw movement again, just at the edge of the woods, but when I shone my flashlight, the beam caught only branches. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay there with my sleeping bag pulled tight. The silence pressed against me, and I could hear every sound outside. The crack of twigs, the whisper of wind through the grass, my own shallow breathing. Hours passed like that, with me half asleep, half awake, always listening. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard something outside, footsteps in the grass, faint and deliberate. At one point, I was certain I heard the breathing again, just outside the tent. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the flap. I just lay there, frozen, staring at the thin fabric between me and whatever was out there. When the sky finally began to lighten, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The fire was long dead, and the clearing looked different in the pale morning light. I unzipped the tent slowly, half expecting to see someone standing there, but it was empty. The field was quiet, the ridge still dark against the sky, and the woods still thick and heavy. Nothing moved. No signs of footprints, no broken branches where someone might have walked. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, watching, moving just close enough to remind me I wasn't alone. I packed up quickly, hardly stopping to eat. The unease never left. Every time I turned my back, I felt the weight of eyes on me, even though there was nothing there. The figure on the ridge, the breathing in the woods, the footsteps near my tent. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted but alert, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. I didn't stop until I was on the road, miles away, the forest shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror. Even now, I don't know who or what it was. I tell myself it was just another camper, maybe a hunter or a hiker who happened to be nearby. But the way they moved across the ridge, the sound of their breathing so close behind me, the silence that followed, it didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt like I had stumbled into someone else's space. Someone who didn't want me there. Someone who made sure I knew it without ever showing their face. And that, more than anything, has kept me from ever going back to that place again. I woke up early that morning with a plan to spend the day hiking out to a place I had only seen on maps. It was an old fire lookout tower, abandoned for years, sitting on a ridge deep in the forest. The route wasn't marked by trails anymore, so it meant bushwhacking most of the way, but I had done hikes like that before. I packed light but carefully. A backpack with water, snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, my phone with an offline map, and a small knife. I didn't think I would need more than that since I wasn't planning on camping out. The idea was to reach the tower, spend some time exploring it, then head back before dark. The day started out calm. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the smell of pine and wet earth. I parked my car off the dirt road and started in, following the faint remnants of what had once been a logging trail. At first it was easy, the ground flat and soft under my boots, but as I went further the trees grew thicker and the ground rougher. The forest swallowed me in every direction until the world outside felt like it didn't exist anymore. Hours passed with nothing but the sound of my own steps and the occasional call of a bird echoing through the canopy. The further I went, the quieter it seemed to become. The wind barely touched the ground where I walked, and the thick underbrush made it harder to move quickly. Branches tugged at my jacket and scraped against my arms. I had to push my way through at times, lifting my knees high to step over fallen logs slick with moss. I stopped to check my map around midday and realized I had covered less distance than I thought. The terrain had slowed me down more than I expected. I considered turning back, but the thought of making it to that tower had been in my mind for weeks. I told myself I would push through, take shorter breaks, and make up the time. As the day wore on, the forest grew darker, even though it wasn't yet evening. The trees closed in, taller and denser than before, their branches forming a tangled ceiling overhead. It was hard to tell how far the sun had moved because so little light reached the forest floor. Every so often I would catch myself glancing behind me, uneasy without really knowing why. I hadn't seen or heard another person since I left the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I tried to ignore it and focus on the ground in front of me, but small things started to stand out. A faint path of flattened brush that looked too fresh. A broken branch that didn't look like it had fallen naturally. Footprints in the mud near a stream. Not animal but human, though older than a day or two. They pointed in the same direction I was headed. By the time I reached the ridge where the tower was supposed to be, my legs were burning from the climb and the sky had turned pale with the fading light of evening. The air up high was colder, the wind sharp against my face. Through the trees, I finally caught sight of the tower. It was taller than I imagined, rising above the treetops, its frame rusted and weather-beaten, but still standing. I approached slowly, studying the ground as I walked. There were signs of recent disturbance. Flattened grass, a fire ring that had been used, ashes still dark and clumped together. It wasn't old. Someone had camped there not long ago. My heart picked up, a mix of excitement and caution. I hadn't expected anyone else to be there, but it was clear that at least one other person had come through recently. The tower itself loomed above me, the staircase leading up swaying slightly in the wind. Some of the steps were missing, and the wood looked brittle. I tested each one carefully as I climbed, gripping the railing that creaked and flaked rust into my hands. By the time I reached the top, the view was breathtaking. Forest stretched out in every direction, endless waves of dark green fading into the horizon. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that swallowed the valleys. Inside the cabin at the top, dust coated the floor, but there were more signs of recent use. A blanket folded in one corner. An empty can of beans left on the windowsill. A plastic bottle on its side. Someone had been staying there. Maybe even still was. I stood still for a long moment, listening. The wind rattled the thin metal walls, but underneath it, I thought I heard something else. A shuffle. A step on wood. Not inside with me, but below, near the base of the tower. I crouched low, holding my breath, straining my ears. The sound came again, heavier this time, deliberate. Someone was down there. I peeked out through the gaps in the wall. The light was dim, shadows stretching long, but I caught movement below, just a figure slipping between the trees at the edge of the clearing. I pulled back quickly, pressing my back to the wall, every nerve in my body alive with fear. I hadn't seen details, just the shape of a person. They weren't making themselves known, and that was what unsettled me most. Minutes dragged by as I waited in silence, heart pounding. I kept telling myself it could have been another hiker, someone else curious about the tower. But hikers don't creep around without announcing themselves, and hikers don't camp miles into the woods with no trail to follow. Whoever it was had chosen this place for a reason. I decided I couldn't stay up there. The tower felt like a trap, one way up and one way down. If someone wanted to corner me, I would have no escape. Slowly, carefully, I descended, every step groaning under my weight. The air seemed to grow thicker with every foot closer to the ground. I kept scanning the shadows, but there was no one in sight when I finally reached the clearing. I didn't wait. I tightened my backpack straps and started back the way I came, forcing my tired legs to move faster. The forest was almost black now, the last scraps of daylight disappearing, and I had to use my flashlight. Its narrow beam cut through the dark, catching on branches and tree trunks, throwing shadows that made the woods feel alive around me. Every few minutes, I heard it, the crack of a stick breaking, the rustle of brush, a faint sound of footsteps that weren't mine. Always behind me, never close enough to see. My pace quickened, my breathing ragged, but no matter how far I went, the sounds stayed with me. They matched my movements, stopping when I stopped, starting again when I forced myself to keep moving. I knew I wouldn't make it back to the road before full darkness. My best chance was to find a spot to hide, stay silent, and wait until daylight. I veered off the faint path I'd been following, pushing through brush until I found a cluster of boulders wedged together, forming a narrow space I could squeeze into. I crouched low, turned off my flashlight, and pulled my knees to my chest. The forest swallowed me in blackness. My ears strained for any sound. At first, all I heard was my own heartbeat. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps came again. Slow, steady. They crunched the leaves closer and closer until they were right outside my hiding spot. I covered my mouth with my hand, holding my breath, not daring to move. The steps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it breathing. Heavy, uneven, just feet away from where I was curled up. The air felt like it was crushing me, pressing in on all sides. I stayed frozen, every muscle aching, until the sound finally faded, the steps moving away. I didn't move for hours. I sat there, cramped and shaking, until the first faint glow of dawn touched the forest. Only then did I crawl out, stiff and sore, my clothes damp with dew. I didn't stop to check my map or eat or drink. I just moved, forcing one foot in front of the other, until I finally broke out of the trees and saw the dirt road where my car was parked. When I reached it, the relief was so strong it nearly knocked me over. But as I pulled open the door and dropped into the seat, something caught my eye. On the ground, next to my tire, were footprints. Fresh ones. They circled the car, overlapping each other, pressed deep into the dirt. Whoever had followed me through the woods had made it there first. I drove away without looking back, every nerve still on edge. Even now, I can't stop thinking about it, how deep in those woods, miles from anyone, someone was waiting, moving silently between the trees, watching me every step of the way. I don't know who they were, or what they wanted, but I know I'll never go back there. I remember that day starting out so ordinary that I never would have thought it would end the way it did. It was one of those warm evenings where the air feels heavy and still, like it's holding something back. I had decided to go for a long walk outside of town, out toward the trails that wound their way past the fields and into the low hills. I liked being alone in places like that, away from the noise, with only the crunch of gravel under my shoes and the faint hum of insects in the grass. The sky was beginning to turn soft with evening light, that strange in-between gray where you can still see clearly, but the shadows are growing longer. I kept walking past the fields until the ground rose, and the trail started climbing into the hills. The dirt path narrowed there, trees gathering on either side, their branches reaching close enough that sometimes they brushed against my shoulders. I told myself I would just walk a little farther, then turn around before it got too dark. But when you're out in a quiet place like that, you lose track of time. I didn't notice how quickly the light was dropping until I reached a stretch of trail that cut between two ridges. The slope of one side was sharp and rocky, the other side a heavy tangle of brush. It felt suddenly tighter there, like the air itself had grown closer around me. That was when I first heard something behind me. At first I thought it was just the echo of my own steps bouncing off the rocks, but when I stopped walking, the sound didn't stop. It came half a second later, like something had delayed just enough to give itself away. It wasn't a clear noise, more like a scuff of weight on dirt. I turned and looked back down the trail. Nothing. Just the empty path stretching toward the fields, the long shadow of a fence post, the faint shimmer of heat still rising from the ground even though the sun had gone down. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a stray dog or even a deer cutting across the trail. I adjusted my backpack and started walking again, slower now, listening more carefully. The noise returned. Not steady, not matching my pace anymore. It came in bursts, 2 quick steps, then silence. Then another, just when I thought it had stopped. My chest felt tight, but I kept going, not wanting to admit that I was nervous. The trail began to climb more sharply, curving around the side of the ridge. I knew if I followed it another half-mile, it would loop back down toward the gravel road where I'd started. I tried to convince myself that I just had to keep walking until then. The air grew cooler as the trees thickened overhead. The last light was slipping fast now, and the trail was shaded so deeply it felt like dusk had fallen hours earlier. I noticed how quiet everything had become. The bugs had stopped buzzing, no birds stirred in the branches, no wind moved through the leaves. The silence pressed down harder than the dark. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Definite steps, heavier than mine. They crunched down hard, dragging slightly like weight was behind them. I froze where I was and turned sharply, my eyes straining to pierce the shadows on the path. For a long second, I thought maybe I saw a shape, just beyond the curve where the trail bent back. But it was too dark, too mixed with the branches, for me to be sure. The skin on my arms prickled, and I realized I was sweating even though the air was cool. I didn't want to run, not yet. Running would mean I had decided it was something real, something following me. I forced myself to keep walking, quicker this time, my ears straining for every sound. The trail felt narrower, the trees pressing in closer. Every few steps I glanced back over my shoulder, but the path stayed empty. Then I heard something that didn't sound like footsteps. It was low, drawn out, almost like breathing. A thick inhale followed by a rough exhale. It wasn't close enough to feel warm on my skin, but it was close enough to be real, close enough to carry through the trees without the wind to disguise it. I felt my stomach drop. I sped up, almost jogging now, my feet thudding harder against the dirt. My backpack bounced against my shoulders, the straps digging into my collarbone. My mouth went dry as I listened, and sure enough, the steps followed, quicker now matching me. My body surged with panic. I broke into a run, my legs pounding the path, my breath loud in my ears. The trail twisted back and forth, and every time I rounded a corner, I expected to see someone waiting ahead. I kept running until my lungs burned, and when I finally risked a glance behind me, I thought I saw it again, a shadow pulling back into the trees, something tall moving where it shouldn't have. My heart thumped so hard I could feel it in my throat. The trail leveled out suddenly, spitting me into a small clearing where the trees opened up and the last pale light of evening lingered. My chest heaved as I stopped, bent over, listening. The sound had stopped. No steps, no breathing, nothing. Just me, standing alone in that silent patch of grass with the ridge rising dark and steep behind me. I knew the road wasn't far. Just down the slope, past the last bend, I could reach it. But standing there, I felt exposed, like the open clearing was worse than the narrow trail. At least on the trail, I could hear if something came up behind me. Here, anything could be standing at the edge of the trees, watching. I forced myself to move again, taking quick steps toward the far side of the clearing. My legs shook with every stride. My ears strained, waiting for the sound to return, but the silence hung heavy and endless. I reached the other side and plunged back into the trees, the darkness swallowing me again. The trail sloped down sharply now, the loose dirt sliding under my shoes. I stumbled, caught myself on a branch, and kept going, half sliding down the hill until I burst out onto the gravel road. I stopped there, hands on my knees, gasping for air. The road stretched empty in both directions, the fields on either side washed in dim gray. I looked back once at the trailhead, the trees black and crowded together. Nothing moved. No sound came, just the heavy dark, thick and waiting. I walked fast down the road toward town, not daring to look back again. The whole way, I kept expecting to hear it behind me, the crunch of steps on gravel, the scrape of breathing in the still air. But nothing came. I didn't stop until I saw the first porch light glowing at the edge of town, and only then did I let myself slow down. When I finally reached my own street, the ordinary world felt wrong, too normal compared to the thick silence of the hills. I went inside and locked the door behind me, my hands trembling as I slid the bolt shut. I stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the clock, normal sounds that felt almost foreign after what I had just left behind. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the curve of the trail behind me, the hint of movement in the shadows, the sound of breathing drifting just close enough to hear. I never went back to those trails again, not after dark, not alone. Even now, when I think about it, I know deep down that something was out there, and it wasn't my imagination. It was real, and it was following me. And the worst part is that I never found out what it was. I never saw its face. I never knew how close it came. I only know that I made it out that night, because I didn't stop running. If I had paused a little longer, if I had waited one more moment on that trail, maybe I wouldn't have made it to the road at all. That thought has never left me. It still lingers every time I walk alone at night, every time I hear a sound in the dark that doesn't fit. Because once you've felt it, that presence just behind you, close enough to breathe the same air, you don't forget. You never forget. I never thought a simple drive home could turn into one of the most terrifying nights of my life. I had been out late, working longer than I wanted, and by the time I left, it was already past 11 at night. The roads were quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes on weeknights when most people are already asleep. I decided to take the back route home, a stretch of road that cut through miles of fields and woods. It was darker and lonelier than the main highway, but it was shorter, and I had driven it plenty of times before. That night, though, it felt different from the very start. The first thing I noticed was how heavy the air felt. Even though my windows were closed and the air conditioning was on, it seemed like the night was pressing against the car, smothering it away. The road was narrow, just 2 lanes, with a ditch on each side and endless stretches of trees beyond that. The trees leaned in, their branches meeting over the road in certain spots, making it feel like I was driving through a tunnel. My headlights carved out a narrow slice of visibility, but beyond that was nothing but darkness. I kept my eyes on the road, hands tight on the wheel. After about 15 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen another car at all. Not one set of headlights in either direction. Usually, I'd pass at least 1 or 2 people. The silence inside the car made it worse. The hum of the engine and the sound of the tires on asphalt seemed too loud. I turned off the radio because even that felt out of place. As I came around a bend, I saw something up ahead on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just an animal. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield. The headlights fell on it, and I realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was a car, pulled halfway off the road into the ditch. The angle of it was strange, like it had veered suddenly, and then just stopped. The front end was tilted downward, the back slightly raised, and one of the doors was open. I slowed to a crawl as I passed it, my heart rate rising. The car was dark inside, no lights on, no movement. The open door swung slightly in the breeze. A dull creak I could hear even over the sound of my own vehicle. I couldn't see anyone nearby. For a moment, I debated pulling over, but something deep in my gut told me not to. Everything about it felt wrong. I pressed down on the accelerator and kept going. A mile or so later, I was still thinking about it. I tried to come up with reasonable explanations. Maybe someone had broken down and walked to get help. Maybe they had been picked up already. Still, the image of that open door, swaying back and forth, wouldn't leave my mind. That was when I noticed the car behind me. It must have appeared not long after I passed the stranded one, but I didn't notice it right away. I only caught it in my mirror because its headlights flickered for a second as if they had bounced on uneven ground. My stomach sank. It was following at a distance, not too close, not too far, just hanging back. I thought maybe it was a coincidence, someone else using the same route, but something about the steady way it kept behind me made my skin crawl. I sped up a little. So did they. I slowed back down, pretending maybe I was just paranoid. They slowed too, keeping that exact same distance. No matter what I did, they mirrored it. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the more I watched the mirror, the worse I felt. The road stretched on, twisting and cutting through thicker patches of woods. I knew there wouldn't be a gas station or store for miles. It was just me, the empty road, and whoever was behind me. The minutes dragged. I started to sweat, my hands slippery on the wheel. Every instinct in me said not to pull over, not to stop. The road eventually straightened out into a long stretch where I could see far ahead. I pressed harder on the gas, pushing the car faster than I normally would on that road. My heart was pounding in my ears as I watched the speedometer climb. For a moment, it seemed like I was pulling away. The headlights behind me grew smaller, but then, without warning, they surged forward. Whoever was driving was closing the gap quickly, much faster than before. Panic set in. I pushed my car harder, the engine whining, the whole vehicle shaking as I reached speeds I had never dared to hit on that road. The trees blurred by on either side, and I gripped the wheel so tightly my fingers ached. Still, the car behind me kept coming, closer and closer until its headlights filled my mirrors, blinding me. I could feel the pressure of their front bumper almost brushing mine. My whole body was tense, waiting for the impact, but they held back just enough. My thoughts were scattered, torn between trying to stay on the road and figuring out what to do if they actually rammed me. There was nowhere safe to pull off, nowhere to hide. Just woods and darkness. After what felt like forever, I saw a small dirt road branching off to the right. It was barely visible, almost hidden by overgrown bushes. Without thinking, I swerved onto it, gravel crunching and spraying out from under my tires. My headlights bounced wildly as the car jolted over the uneven ground. I risked a glance in the mirror. The other car shot past on the main road, its headlights fading into the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The dirt road was narrow, twisting, and full of potholes. Branches scraped against the sides of my car. I slowed down, trying to catch my breath, but the deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. I had no idea where it led, and part of me worried I had just trapped myself. I finally came to a clearing, wide enough to turn around. My hands were shaking as I spun the wheel and pointed my car back toward the main road. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, staring into the darkness, listening. The forest was silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just silence pressing in. I pulled back onto the main road carefully, half expecting to see those headlights waiting for me. But the road was empty. I drove the rest of the way home like a machine, eyes darting to the mirrors every few seconds, muscles stiff with tension. When I finally pulled into my driveway, my whole body sagged with exhaustion. Inside my house, I locked every door and window, pacing the rooms, unable to shake the feeling that I had been hunted. I kept thinking back to that first car in the ditch, the open door swinging in the dark. I couldn't stop wondering if it had been a trap, set up to lure me into stopping, to get me out of my car. That night, I barely slept. Every time headlights passed outside, my heart jumped. Even now, I can still see the reflection of those lights in my mirror, blinding and close, so close it felt like they were breathing down my neck. And I keep asking myself what would have happened if I had stopped, if I had gotten out, if I hadn't taken that dirt road at the last second. The answer chills me more than anything else. I'll never know for sure, but deep down, I believe I came close to something I was never supposed to walk away from. It started out like any other quiet day, the kind of day where you don't expect anything unusual to happen. I had decided to take a long walk out into the countryside, something I liked to do whenever I felt like clearing my head. The weather was cool, a light breeze moving through the trees, and the sky was clear enough that I could see the sun sinking little by little toward the horizon. I had no plan, no real destination. I just wanted to be away from the noise, away from people, and out where the land stretched wide and the woods pressed close. The path I followed wasn't even a real trail. It was one of those dirt tracks that came from tractors or old farm trucks passing through, the kind of road that wasn't maintained but still carried the marks of tires from time to time. On both sides of me, there were stretches of open fields that eventually led into thick woods. From a distance, the trees looked peaceful, just dark walls of trunks and green canopy, but up close, they seemed to swallow light. I remember thinking how easy it would be to get lost if someone walked in too far without paying attention. I carried a small backpack with a bottle of water, a flashlight, and a jacket in case it got cold. I wasn't planning to stay out long, but I knew myself, I liked to wander, and sometimes I ended up farther than I meant to. The ground was uneven, small ruts and rocks hidden under weeds, so I kept my eyes low as I walked. After about an hour, I realized I had gone deeper than I thought, farther from the small town where I lived. The silence grew heavier, broken only by the occasional crow or the rustle of grass in the wind. It was then that I noticed the road veering into the woods. Something about the shade under those trees pulled at me. The air seemed cooler there, the shadows longer, and I decided to follow it. I stepped into the woods, and the first thing that hit me was the smell: damp soil, old leaves, and that earthy weight that only comes when you're under thick cover. The canopy overhead blocked out a lot of the light, and in some places the ground was already dark, even though the sun hadn't fully set. I kept walking, deeper into the trees. At first, it felt calm, the kind of quiet you think of when you imagine being away from the world. But as I went on, that peace turned into something else. The sounds of birds faded. Even the breeze seemed to die, leaving the woods strangely still. My footsteps on the leaves sounded louder than they should have. I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, that natural instinct telling you that something might be off, even when you don't have proof. The deeper I went, the more I realized I couldn't see much of the sky anymore. The path narrowed and twisted, roots cutting across it, branches hanging low. Every so often, I thought I heard something off to the side, a faint crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. Each time I stopped and looked, there was nothing there. Just trees, trunks lined up like silent watchers. My heartbeat picked up, and I tried to brush it off as nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. After maybe 20 more minutes of walking, I reached a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a space where the trees thinned out, letting a sliver of the dim sky through. I stopped to drink from my water bottle, and that's when I saw movement on the other side of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some other animal, but then I realized it was a person. A figure, dark against the tree line, standing very still. Too still. I froze. The figure didn't move closer, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge me. It just stood there. I stared for a long moment, trying to make out details, but the dim light made it impossible. All I could tell was that it was tall and thin. My first thought was that maybe it was another hiker or someone hunting, but there was no sign of a rifle, no bright orange vest. Something about the way they stood, completely motionless, made my skin crawl. I didn't want to keep standing there, so I turned and walked quickly down the other side of the clearing. I didn't run, but I kept my pace brisk, feeling my heart pound harder with every step. The path curved and bent, and after a while, I risked a glance behind me. I didn't see the figure anymore, but that didn't comfort me. It felt worse, like it had vanished into the woods without a sound. The forest grew darker as the sun dropped. My flashlight was in my bag, but I didn't want to use it yet. I told myself I'd keep walking until I reached the edge of the woods, but I couldn't remember how far in I had gone. Every tree looked the same. Every twist of the path mirrored the last. I tried to calm myself, but then I heard it again, footsteps behind me. Faint, but steady. I stopped dead in my tracks, listening. The footsteps stopped too. I held my breath, waiting, every muscle in my body tensed. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then slowly, the sound of breathing reached me. Heavy, steady breathing, like someone trying to stay quiet, but too close to hide it. It came from behind, somewhere among the trees. My throat went dry, and I forced myself to keep moving. My legs felt heavy, but I picked up my pace, almost jogging now. The breathing grew fainter, then closer again, as though whoever it was kept adjusting their distance. I didn't dare look back this time. I just wanted out. I wanted the woods to end. The ground dipped, and I realized I was moving downhill. My shoes slipped on loose dirt, and I nearly fell before catching myself on a branch. The air smelled thicker here, more humid, and I could hear the trickle of water somewhere nearby. I thought maybe if I followed the stream, it would lead me out. I headed toward the sound, crashing through brush, no longer caring about the path. That's when I heard it again, branches snapping, heavier now, closer. Whoever was behind me wasn't trying to stay hidden anymore. I broke into a full run, heart hammering, lungs burning as I pushed myself through the thick growth. My jacket caught on thorns, ripping the fabric, but I didn't stop. I could feel the presence behind me, too close, too deliberate. I burst out onto the edge of the stream, water glinting faintly in the last scraps of light. My legs felt weak, but I forced them to move along the bank, slipping on wet rocks, splashing into shallow water. The cold soaked my shoes, but all I cared about was distance. I kept going until I finally saw it, an opening through the trees where the land sloped up again. I scrambled toward it, climbing, grabbing roots and rocks to pull myself higher. When I reached the top, I looked down one last time. In the dimness below, I saw movement. A figure stepped out of the trees, standing on the bank of the stream where I had been just moments before. Even in the low light, I could tell it was the same person from the clearing. They stood there, looking up in my direction, motionless again, as if they had been following me the entire time without a sound. I didn't wait to see what they would do next. I turned and ran, every muscle screaming, until finally the trees thinned and I stumbled out into another field. My chest felt like it was on fire, and I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. When I looked back, the woods were still. The figure hadn't followed me out, at least not that I could see. I kept moving, forcing myself across the field until I found the dirt track again. The night had fully settled in now, and I finally pulled out my flashlight, its weak beam bouncing across the uneven road. It took me nearly an hour to find my way back to the edge of town. Every step I took, I kept looking behind me, half expecting to see someone there. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty road. When I finally reached home, I locked every door, every window, and sat in silence, replaying it all in my head. The still figure in the clearing, the footsteps behind me, the breathing in the dark, the way they had stood at the stream, watching me climb away. Even now, I don't know who it was or what they wanted. All I know is that I wasn't alone out there, and whoever it was moved through those woods as if they belonged to them. I had wandered in without thought, but I left with the clear knowledge that I had been followed, maybe even hunted. I never went back to those woods again. The memory of that night stays sharp, carved deep into me. Whenever I think about it, I can still hear the crunch of leaves behind me, the steady sound of someone breathing just out of sight. And I know that if I had tripped, if I had fallen, or if I had stopped for even a moment too long, I might not have made it out at all. It was late in the afternoon when I started walking down the old service road that cut deep through the woods. The air felt heavy, the kind of stillness that presses against your ears and makes every sound sharper than it should be. I had been out there plenty of times before, usually with friends or family, but this time I was alone. The plan was simple, just to get in a long walk, clear my head, and maybe take a few photos of the fading light slipping between the trees. The dirt road was rough, full of uneven patches and scattered stones. My boots crunched with each step, and every crunch seemed to echo far louder than it should have. To my right, the forest stretched endlessly, thick with pine and underbrush, branches tangled together like locked fingers. To my left, the land sloped downward into a shallow gully, filled with long grass that swayed without any wind. I kept moving, forcing my eyes to stay on the path ahead, even though the corners of my vision kept catching shadows that didn't seem to settle right. By the time I had walked about a mile in, the sky had darkened more than I expected. The sun hadn't dropped completely, but the trees blocked enough light to make it feel later than it was. I could barely see the horizon through the wall of trunks, just a thin strip of fading orange. I told myself I would turn back soon, maybe after another half-mile. But something about the silence kept pulling me forward, like I needed to find out what lay further down the road. I passed an old hunting stand leaning against a tree, half-rotted, the ladder rungs broken halfway up. That meant someone had once used this place, though by the looks of it, not for years. The smell of damp earth and pine needles was stronger here, and I noticed the ground had patches of soft mud, which meant I had wandered closer to one of the low, wet spots in the forest. I slowed down and glanced at the ground, realizing I wasn't the only one who had walked this way. There were tracks in the mud, long, wide prints, too big to be a dog, too wide for a deer. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. The edges were still defined, not washed away. I told myself they must have been left by some hiker with big boots, or maybe a hunter who passed through a day or two ago. Still, I found myself walking more carefully, stepping quieter without really meaning to. My hands tightened around the straps of my backpack, and I noticed my breathing had gotten shallow, as if I didn't want the forest to hear me. After a while, I realized I had gone further than I meant to. The road curved slightly downhill, and the light was fading faster than I thought it would. I stopped to check the time, but the screen of my phone looked pale and useless in the dim light. The battery was low, barely 10%, and I didn't want to waste it keeping the screen on. I slid it back into my pocket, and that's when I heard it. It was faint, almost lost in the stillness. A sound like a branch snapping, but not sharp, more like something heavy pressing down on wood until it cracked. I froze where I was, every part of me tightening. My ears strained, waiting for more. After a few seconds, I heard it again, this time closer, somewhere off to my right in the thick trees. The forest felt alive in that moment, like it was holding its breath with me. I stared into the trees, but the shadows between the trunks were too thick to see anything clear. I thought maybe it was a deer moving, but it sounded heavier, like something dragging a bit of weight with each step. I stood there too long, just listening, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Finally, I forced myself to move. My boots scuffed the gravel as I walked quicker, almost a jog but not quite. I told myself to keep calm, to just head back the way I came, but my nerves kept sparking at every sound. The forest, which had been quiet before, now seemed alive with tiny noises, the rustle of leaves, the faint creak of branches swaying even though the air was still. Every sound made me snap my head around, scanning the shadows. When I rounded a bend in the road, I glanced back just once. For a split second, I thought I saw movement between the trees, something pale, low to the ground, slipping behind a trunk. I didn't stop to study it. My chest tightened, and I started walking faster. The air grew colder as the last of the sunlight bled away. My boots crunched too loud, my breath too harsh. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, but the road stretched empty, just gravel fading into gloom. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was matching me step for step, staying just out of sight in the trees. A few minutes later, I heard it again. Not the crack of wood this time, but a sound like breathing. Low, heavy, pulled through the throat of something big. It was behind me, close enough that the hairs on my neck stood straight. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just black shapes of trees pressed together like a wall. My chest hammered, and for a moment, I considered breaking into a full sprint. But something in me knew better. Running would only draw it out. I forced myself to keep walking, each step deliberate, though my legs wanted to run. My mind kept spinning with guesses. A bear, maybe. A wild boar. Something real, something that belonged here. But the longer it followed, the less it felt like a passing animal. It wasn't moving off in another direction, it was staying with me, tracking me. By the time I reached the old hunting stand again, the last of the light was gone. The forest pressed in black on both sides, and the only thing I could see clearly was the narrow strip of road in front of me. My breathing had turned ragged, and I could taste metal in the back of my mouth from the fear. I forced myself to keep going, eyes locked forward, every muscle coiled tight. That was when I heard it again, closer than ever. Heavy breathing, deep and uneven, just beyond the edge of the road. I didn't dare look. My legs finally gave in, and I broke into a run. The gravel skidded under my boots as I sprinted, my backpack slapping against my shoulders. The sound of my footsteps pounded in my ears, but underneath it, I thought I could hear something else moving, crashing through the brush to keep up. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I could see the faint outline of the road bending upward ahead, the part one knew led back toward the edge of the woods. I pushed harder, every step feeling like my legs might give out, until finally I saw the break in the trees where the road opened back toward the fields. I didn't look back, not even once. I just kept running until I was clear of the tree line and standing in the open, my chest heaving, sweat burning cold against my skin. When I finally stopped, bent over and gasping, the forest behind me was silent again. No footsteps, no breathing, no movement. Just the dark line of trees standing quiet, as if nothing had ever been there. I stayed there a long time, staring into the black until I was sure nothing was coming out. Then I made my way back home, never letting myself look away from the road ahead. I didn't stop until I was back inside, doors locked, lights on, the sound of my own breathing slowly settling down. Even now, I can still hear that breathing in my head. Heavy, uneven, just behind me in the dark. I know it was something real, something that was watching me the whole time. And I know that if I had stayed just a little longer, if I had slowed down or stopped, I might not have made it out of those woods at all. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, the kind that slips by without ever being remembered. The sun had already gone down, but the summer air still clung to me, warm and sticky. I decided to take a walk down a back road I hadn't used in years. It was one of those narrow country roads that stretched between fields and patches of woods, with very few houses around. I remembered it from when I was younger, how the gravel crunched underfoot, how the night insects seemed louder there, how the air always smelled faintly of soil and leaves. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I told myself it would just be a calm walk to clear my head. The further I went, the less light there was. Street lights had never reached this road, and only a thin slice of the moon hung above, pale and weak, barely lighting the ground. The trees on either side seemed to lean closer together, their branches crossing overhead, blotting out more of the sky until I felt like I was walking through a tunnel. Every step seemed to echo in my ears, the crunch of gravel exaggerated by the silence. I slowed my pace and kept glancing behind me, even though I knew I was alone. Still, something felt off. I've walked in the dark before, but this was different. The woods had a heavy stillness, like everything inside them had gone quiet on purpose. Not even the crickets seemed to chirp as much here. The deeper I went, the more my chest tightened with a strange pressure, like the air itself wanted me to turn around. I noticed it first when I stopped to catch my breath. Just behind me, faint but sharp, there was a snap of a twig. At first I told myself it was probably a deer. This was farmland country, and deer cut through the woods all the time. I forced myself to start walking again, maybe even a little faster. But then another sound came, not the sudden leap of a deer, but the steady, measured crunch of weight pressing into gravel, matching my steps with a slight delay. I froze. My ears strained so hard it felt like they were ringing. For a moment, it stopped. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just my own steps echoing in the emptiness. I forced a laugh under my breath and started again, slower this time, dragging my shoes just to hear the sound they made. But when I stopped, the echo stopped, and a moment later, after I had gone still, there was one extra crunch that did not come from me. My mouth went dry. I kept walking, but this time my steps were fast and clumsy. I didn't want to turn around because I was afraid of what I might see. I focused on the pale strip of gravel lit by the moon, telling myself to just keep going until I reached the main road again. But the sound behind me didn't fade. It didn't rush forward or fall behind. It just stayed there, keeping pace, never too close, never too far. I reached a bend where the road dipped slightly, and the shadows seemed thicker. I felt exposed walking through it, like something in the dark could see me clearer than I could see it. My pulse hammered so hard in my ears I almost missed it, the sound of breathing. Not close enough to be right behind me, but close enough that it carried across the still air. Heavy, steady, strained like someone forcing air through their nose. It was real, not some trick of my own breath. That was the first moment I considered running, but my legs hesitated. Running meant admitting there was something real behind me. Running meant I had to accept it was not just my imagination. Still, the thought of slowing down, of letting whatever was back there get closer, was worse. I leaned forward and started to jog, the gravel slipping under my shoes. The sounds behind me quickened too. That was all I needed to break into a full run. My arms pumped at my sides, my feet barely catching the ground before pushing off again. Every breath tore through my chest, hot and sharp, but I kept going. The road seemed endless, each shadow stretching farther than the last. My eyes darted left and right for any sign of a house, a driveway, anything. But there was nothing, just the black line of trees and the narrow strip of road. I didn't dare look back. I could hear it now, closer, the crunch of gravel heavier than my own, the breathing rougher, like whoever or whatever it was had been running for a long time. My own body started to fail me. My thighs burned, my knees felt like they were splintering, and the air I pulled in didn't seem to reach deep enough. My vision blurred at the edges, but I kept running, each step fueled by pure panic. Finally, I saw a faint light ahead. one lone farmhouse porch lamp cutting through the dark. It felt impossibly far away, but it was all I had. I pushed harder, ignoring the stabbing pain in my ribs. The sound behind me grew louder, heavier, as if it was gaining on me no matter how fast I moved. The last 100 feet felt like the longest distance of my life. My lungs screamed, my legs wobbled, but I didn't stop. I tore up the gravel driveway toward the house, the sound behind me still following, still chasing. The light from the porch grew stronger, spilling across the yard. My shadow stretched in front of me, long and broken. And then, just as I reached the steps, everything stopped. The gravel behind me went silent. The breathing vanished. The air felt lighter, thinner, as if whatever had been there had melted back into the darkness. I turned finally, my chest heaving so hard I thought I'd collapse. But there was nothing. Just the empty stretch of road leading back into the trees. No figure, no movement, not even a trace of sound. The gravel lay untouched, the shadows heavy and still. It was as if nothing had ever been there at all. I stood frozen on the porch for what felt like forever, staring into the black line of the road, waiting for the faintest sign of movement. But nothing came. The night remained silent, thick, and watching. I couldn't bring myself to leave until the first gray light of morning pushed through the trees, soft and slow, washing away the shadows. When I finally stepped off that porch, the road looked ordinary again, the gravel quiet, the woods alive with bird calls and the buzz of insects. But I knew what I had heard, what I had felt breathing in the dark. And the worst part was that I couldn't prove it. There were no prints on the gravel, no sign of pursuit, nothing but the memory of steps matching mine, of breath too close to be my own. Even now, when I think back on it, I can still hear it. That steady crunch in the gravel, that strained breathing behind me. And I know if I ever walk that road again after dark, I might not be fast enough the second time. I never thought much about fear until that night, the kind of fear that doesn't let you think straight, the kind that makes every breath sound too loud and every heartbeat feel like it's echoing outside your chest. It started as something simple, something so normal that I didn't even think twice about it. I had gone out for a late walk, something I had done 100 times before. It was supposed to clear my head, supposed to be quiet and calm. But the world doesn't always let things stay calm, not when you find yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time. The air was cool, the kind of chill that sinks into your hands if you leave them out of your pockets too long. The road stretched out ahead, empty, with no cars passing and no houses in sight for a long way. The streetlights were spaced too far apart, leaving long shadows between them. I could see my breath puffing out, fading quick into the dark, but the sound of my steps felt louder than it should have been. I tried not to think about it, tried to focus on the rhythm of walking, one step after another. There was a field to one side of the road, tall grass moving with the wind, making a dry whispering sound that followed me. On the other side, trees lined the ditch, bare branches reaching out over the edge of the road like they wanted to grab hold of something. I kept looking straight ahead, but every so often I caught myself glancing sideways, into the shadows. I told myself it was nothing, just the kind of thoughts that creep in when you're out there alone at night. I walked farther than I usually did. My shoes made a soft crunch against the gravel at the edge of the pavement, and the sound echoed in a way that made me feel like someone else was keeping pace, just a little behind. Every time I slowed, the echo seemed to slow too. I stopped altogether once, standing there in the dim yellow light of one street lamp, listening so hard it made my ears ring. Nothing. Just the wind across the field and the far-off hum of some machine, maybe a generator or a motor left running. I started again, but slower now. My body felt tight, shoulders up, every muscle ready to flinch. I told myself it was nerves, nothing more, but then I saw it. Up ahead, past the reach of the next light, something moved across the road. Not fast, not stumbling, just walking. A shape, tall and steady, crossing from one side to the other and disappearing into the dark edge of the trees. I froze where I was, breath stuck in my throat. The figure hadn't even looked my way, just moved across like it had somewhere to be. But out there, at that hour, there shouldn't have been anyone. I stood there for too long, my legs begging me to move, but my mind trying to decide which way. Go forward and risk getting closer, or turn back and walk into more darkness behind me. The road felt endless both ways, and the lights seemed weaker than they had before. Finally, I pushed myself to keep walking, but slow or careful, like I didn't want my steps to be noticed. When I reached the spot where I'd seen the figure cross, I stopped again. The trees there looked thicker, shadows piled on shadows, the ground covered in dead leaves. I couldn't see anyone. No movement, no sound but the same low hum from before. I leaned a little closer, trying to make sense of the shapes in the dark, when I caught something faint. Breathing. Not mine, it was deeper, heavier, like someone trying to control it, hold it back, but not quite able to. Every instinct in me screamed to run. I turned fast, heading back the way I had come, steps quicker than before. My hands were fists in my pockets, my chest tight. I told myself not to look back, but I couldn't help it. Over my shoulder, I thought I saw movement again, something shifting between the trees, keeping its distance but not stopping. I walked faster, almost breaking into a run. My mouth was dry, and every sound around me seemed sharper. The crunch of gravel, the rustle of the grass, the rhythm of my breathing. I kept checking behind me, each glance catching a blur of something pale between the trees. I tried to convince myself it was just tricks of the light, but I couldn't shake the sound of that breathing. By the time I reached the stretch of road with more houses, my legs were shaking. I walked straight past them, not wanting to stop, not wanting to draw any attention. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would give me away. When I finally reached my own street, I didn't relax. I half expected to hear steps quickening behind me, something rushing up before I could make it to my door. Inside, the silence felt thick, almost worse than outside. I stood at the window in the dark, watching the street. The wind moved the branches, the streetlight hummed, but nothing came out of the shadows. I stayed there for what felt like an hour, waiting. I barely slept that night, lying awake listening for anything out of place. Every creak in the house made my chest tighten. At one point I thought I heard something outside, the faintest crunch of gravel on the road, but when I went back to the window there was nothing. The next day I tried to push it out of my mind. I told myself it was nothing more than someone out walking, same as me. But when I went by that stretch of road again in daylight, something caught my eye. At the edge of the trees, pressed down into the leaves and dirt, were footprints. They weren't mine, too big and too deep. They trailed off into the woods, too far to see where they led. I never went back down that road at night again. Even in the daytime, I walked faster past that part, eyes fixed on the ground. The memory of that steady shape crossing the road, the sound of that heavy breathing just out of sight, never left me. It stayed with me, sharp and real, proof that sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones we imagine. They're the ones that are actually there watching, waiting, close enough that you can hear them breathing in the dark. I knew what I heard that night, and I knew what I saw. The figure wasn't lost, wasn't wandering. It was there on purpose, moving with direction, moving like it had all the time in the world. And the worst part wasn't that it was out there. The worst part was that it knew I was too. I had not planned for anything unusual that day. It was supposed to be one of those ordinary evenings where the air felt a little cooler, the sun dipped behind the trees, and the quiet hum of the outside world was enough to keep my mind at ease. I decided to go for a walk along the narrow road that stretched past the fields and slowly bled into a thick patch of woods. I had walked that road many times before, and I never thought much about it. The path was familiar, the trees tall and silent, and the gravel under my shoes made a sound that was almost comforting. At first, everything felt calm. The fields were fading into darkness, but the sky above them still held the last bits of orange light. The smell of dry grass mixed with the faint scent of dirt that the breeze carried from the forest. My footsteps echoed in the quiet, and every now and then, a bird rustled in the distance, heading back to its nest before night fully set in. There was nothing out of place, nothing strange, just a slow, peaceful walk. But the further I went, the more the road seemed to close in. The trees on each side of me began to grow closer together, their branches stretching across the top and forming a kind of tunnel. The air grew cooler as the light dimmed. I could no longer see much of the sky above me, and with each step, the sound of the gravel grew sharper, louder, almost as if I were walking too fast, though my pace hadn't changed. I thought maybe I was just paying too much attention to it, but the sound made me uneasy. It wasn't until I stopped for a moment that I realized something else. When I stood still, the crunch of gravel didn't stop right away. It carried on 1, 2, maybe 3 extra steps behind me, as if someone else had been walking there too, just a little slower than me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the shadows, and the long stretch of the empty road fading back into the dim fields. I tried to tell myself it was my own imagination, maybe an echo, maybe the way the gravel slid when I stopped too suddenly. I started walking again, a little faster this time, and the sound came back, my own steps, followed by the faintest delay of another. I could feel the back of my neck tightening, the small hairs standing on end. The woods around me had grown darker by then, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but every time I looked, the road was empty. The silence behind me seemed heavier than it should have been. Even the birds had gone quiet. I told myself to keep going, to focus on reaching the clearing up ahead where the road opened again near an old wire fence. I had walked this path enough times to know exactly where I was, but for some reason, that stretch of road felt much longer than it ever had before. My breathing grew uneven, and I found myself tightening my fists as I walked, not knowing why. Then I heard it again, clearer this time, not just the crunch of gravel, but a rhythm. Whoever or whatever was behind me wasn't stepping at the exact same pace. It was staggered, like they were slowing down when I sped up, or catching up when I eased my steps. I didn't want to run, but the urge to move faster was stronger than any thought of staying calm. My strides lengthened, the sound behind me grew sharper, and I could no longer convince myself that I was imagining it. The air was cold in my lungs as I reached the fence line, and I slowed, thinking that maybe if I stood still long enough, whoever it was would reveal themselves. I stopped and turned again, staring hard into the dim road behind me. Nothing moved. The gravel was still. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift with the wind, but there was no clear shape, no figure stepping out into the open. For a moment, I almost laughed at myself. I thought I must have been nervous for no reason. Maybe the crunch of my own steps had bounced off the trees and played tricks on me. But as I stood there, trying to catch my breath, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten even more. In the soft dirt by the fence post, just at the edge where the gravel stopped, there was a print. Not the kind of mark my shoes left, but heavier, deeper, as if someone else had stood there recently. The edges of the print were still sharp, not yet softened by the wind. I didn't linger. I crossed the fence quickly, the metal wire rattling as I moved, and cut through the open field instead of following the road. The grass scratched against my legs as I walked fast, almost running, toward the distant outline of the houses that sat far off at the other end. Every few seconds, I turned my head, scanning the edges of the trees. I couldn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The closer I got to the houses, the safer I felt, but the unease didn't leave me. My chest was tight, and my ears were straining for every sound. When I finally reached the back fence of the first yard and climbed over it, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The night seemed calmer there, quieter, as if whatever had been trailing me had stopped once I left the cover of the woods. I stayed outside for a while longer, leaning against the fence and staring back at the tree line. The shadows swayed with the wind, and the road lay hidden behind them. Nothing moved, nothing broke the silence, but I couldn't forget the sound of those steps following mine, just behind me, keeping their pace with mine until I had finally stepped off that road. I went home after that, but the unease followed me through the night. I replayed it over and over in my head, the crunch of gravel, the staggered rhythm, the print by the fence. I kept telling myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe another walker who turned off into the woods before I looked back. Maybe a stray animal that happened to move in sync with me. But no matter how many times I tried to reason it out, the image of that fresh print in the dirt stayed clear in my mind. Even now, whenever I walk that way, I can't help but listen more closely to the sound of my own steps. I can't help but glance over my shoulder at the empty road. And every time the gravel shifts under my shoes, I wait for that half-second delay, that second rhythm that tells me I am not as alone as I thought. That night changed the way I saw the woods. They weren't just quiet trees and old roads anymore. They held secrets, things you couldn't always see but could feel in the weight of the silence, in the sound of your own steps echoing where they shouldn't. And I knew, without any doubt, that someone else had been there with me on that road, keeping close enough to follow, yet far enough to stay unseen. I never found out who it was. I never saw their face, never heard their voice, never caught more than the sound of them moving just out of reach. But I know they were there. And I know that if I had stopped longer, if I had waited instead of leaving that road, I might have found out what they wanted. That thought has stayed with me more than anything else, the not knowing. The silence of the woods doesn't feel the same anymore, because I've learned how easy it is for someone to hide there, just beyond your sight, waiting, moving when you move, stopping when you stop. And every time I walk alone, I remember how close they must have been that night. Close enough to hear my footsteps, close enough to match them, close enough that the only thing keeping me safe was the choice I made to keep moving forward until I finally stepped out of the trees. It started as a normal day, nothing that stood out from the rest. I had been restless for a while, needing to get away from everything around me, so I decided to take a drive out of town. The weather was warm, late in the summer, and I figured I would go explore some back roads I hadn't been on in years. I threw a few things in the car, a bottle of water, a flashlight, and an old jacket, and I headed out in the afternoon with no real plan other than to get lost for a while and see something new. The road stretched out empty once I left the main highway, cracked asphalt with grass pushing through the edges. I rolled the windows down and let the wind blow through. After about an hour of driving, I came across a dirt road leading off into thick woods. I slowed down and turned onto it. Dust kicked up behind me, and the trees closed in quickly, their branches heavy and leaning across the road. The deeper I went, the rougher the road became, ruts jolting the car, sticks scraping underneath. After a while, I came into a clearing where the road widened out. The trees pulled back just enough to let a little light through, and it looked like a decent spot to stop for a break. I shut off the engine and just sat there listening. There was almost no sound, only a faint buzz of insects and the occasional creak of the trees shifting. It was quiet in a way that made me uneasy, like the whole place was holding its breath. I got out of the car, stretched my legs, and walked a little further into the clearing. The grass was high and dry, brushing against my knees, and the soil underneath was soft, almost like it had been churned up recently. I wandered toward the edge of the trees, looking around. The forest was dense, the kind of place where the light barely made it to the ground. The trunks stood close together, bark dark and rough, with patches of moss clinging on. Something about it felt off. I told myself it was just me overthinking, that I was in the middle of nowhere and not used to so much silence. But then I noticed something strange. About 20 or 30 feet into the tree line, I saw an area where the ground looked disturbed. The leaves and pine needles had been pushed aside, and the soil was darker there, like it had been dug up. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, but as I walked closer, I realized it was too neat, too straight. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, not stepping into the woods yet. My heart had picked up without me meaning to, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing harder. The disturbed earth stretched out in a rectangle, almost like a shallow pit that had been filled back in. My chest felt tight as I stood there staring at it. I couldn't explain why, but it made me feel sick. I turned back toward the car, thinking maybe I should just leave. But as I walked, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, a shift between the trees. I froze, staring into the forest. At first, I couldn't make anything out, only darkness between the trunks, but then I thought I saw the shape of someone moving, slow and deliberate. I blinked and looked harder, but the figure was gone. The unease that had been building inside me was suddenly sharp. I didn't want to believe I saw anyone. I tried to convince myself it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, light and shadow moving with the wind. Still, I walked faster toward the car. My keys were already in my hand when I reached for the door handle, but before I could get in, I heard something. It was faint, but it came from the woods. A sound that was hard to place at first, but the longer I listened, the more certain I became. Breathing. Heavy, uneven breathing. Not an animal. It was too controlled, too human. I stood there frozen, hand on the car door, staring at the tree line. The sound carried in the still air, and it wasn't just from one spot. It seemed to shift, like whoever it was moving slowly from tree to tree. My chest tightened more, and I opened the car door quickly, sliding inside. I locked the doors and sat there gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady myself. I started the engine, but just as I put the car into gear, a thought cut through my panic. If someone was out there watching me, if they wanted to, they could easily block the narrow dirt road ahead. It would be simple: roll a log, drag a branch, and I would be trapped. That idea lodged in my mind, and I couldn't shake it. I sat there with the engine running, staring ahead at the empty road, my mouth dry. Minutes passed. I don't know how many. I kept glancing between the rearview mirror, the side windows, and the trees in front of me. Nothing moved, but the pressure of being watched didn't leave. Finally, I eased the car forward, tires crunching over the dirt. The road stretched ahead, twisting out of sight. I kept my eyes locked on it, afraid to look anywhere else. As I rounded the first bend, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The trees pressed in tighter on both sides, branches scraping along the car. Then, as I came around another curve, my heart sank. Across the road, maybe 30 feet ahead, a tree had fallen. It lay straight across the track, blocking it completely. I hit the brakes hard and just stared. The tree didn't look freshly fallen. The bark was dry, the leaves brittle, but something about the way it sat across the road made me feel cold. It wasn't natural, not the way it had landed perfectly in line, covering the entire path. I didn't want to get out, but I knew my car wouldn't clear it. It wasn't a thick trunk, maybe a foot and a half wide, but it was enough to trap me. My mind raced. I could turn around, but that meant going back toward the clearing, back toward whatever had been breathing out there. I sat gripping the wheel, trying to think. The forest pressed in silent around me. My ears strained for any sound, but all I could hear was my own pulse pounding. Finally, I shifted the car into reverse, backing slowly, keeping my eyes on the road behind me. The rearview mirror showed only narrow dirt stretching back into the trees. I had almost reached the clearing again when I saw something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just another branch, but as I got closer, my stomach twisted. It was a piece of rope, thick and coiled, lying right at the edge of the dirt, partly covered in leaves. It hadn't been there before. I knew it. My mind screamed at me to get out of there. I slammed the car into drive and floored it, swerving back onto the main road. The car bounced and rattled as I pushed it harder than I should have, but I didn't care. I just needed distance. The trees whipped by in a blur, dust rising in clouds behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the highway again. Only then did I slow down, my hands shaking on the wheel. The sky was starting to darken, the last of the sunlight fading, and I drove straight back toward town, refusing to look in the mirrors anymore. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that disturbed patch of earth in the woods, the breathing I heard, the rope by the roadside, the tree laid perfectly across my path. I kept replaying it all in my head, the way it felt so deliberate, like someone had been waiting. In the days after, I told myself I wouldn't go back. But curiosity worked at me. I wanted to know if I had overreacted, if maybe my nerves had twisted something ordinary into something terrifying. A week later, I drove out there again in broad daylight. When I reached the dirt road, I saw immediately that the fallen tree was gone. The track was clear all the way through, no sign of it ever having been blocked. I drove cautiously back to the clearing. The grass was still high, the soil still soft, but the disturbed earth I had seen before was no longer visible. The ground was smooth, as if it had been carefully covered and pressed flat. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the tree line, trying to decide if I should get out. Part of me wanted to walk back into those woods, to prove to myself there was nothing there. But the memory of that breathing, so close, so steady, kept me rooted to the seat. In the end, I turned the car around and left. I haven't been back since. Even now, when I think about it, a chill runs through me. Someone was out there that day. I don't know who or why, but I know what I heard. The rope, the tree, the pit in the ground. It was all too much to be chance. I avoided trouble that afternoon only because I left when I did. I can't shake the thought of what might have happened if I had stayed longer, if I had walked further into the woods, or if I had stepped out of my car to move that tree. I'll never know who was out there, but I know enough to stay away. That road isn't on any maps, and I've never told anyone exactly where it is. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that breathing in my head, slow and steady, coming from the dark. I remember that night with a kind of weight in my chest that never really goes away. It started like nothing special, one of those evenings where I wanted to clear my head and ended up doing something I'd regret. I had been driving back from a long day, the kind of day that makes your skin feel heavy and your thoughts stick together. Instead of heading straight home, I pulled off the main road onto a smaller country road I knew well. It was quieter out there, no lights except the ones from my car, no sound except the engine and the tires grinding against gravel and dirt. I told myself I just needed some air, maybe stop by the old bridge that crossed the shallow creek. I'd been there a few times before, and it was always empty. The road stretched on, narrow and lined with trees that pressed together like they were hiding something behind them. The air felt different when I rolled down the window. Cold, still, almost too still. Usually there were crickets, or the sound of wind through the leaves, but that night it was just silence. I should have taken that as a sign, but I didn't. I parked the car near the bridge, left the headlights on because I didn't like the dark. My shoes crunched against the gravel as I got out, and I walked slowly onto the bridge. The wood was damp, soft in some places, creaking under my weight. The creek below reflected the dim shine of the headlights, a broken shimmer on the moving water. I leaned on the railing and breathed in. It was fresh, damp, smelled like earth and moss. I stood there a while, just looking, listening to the faint sound of water moving under me. Then I noticed something. The sound of footsteps, but not from me. They were faint, slow, and they came from behind me, on the same side of the bridge I had walked from. My chest tightened. I didn't turn right away. At first I thought maybe it was just my own shoes echoing in my head, but then it came again. Slow, steady, too heavy to be an animal. I turned quickly, but the headlights only lit up the front part of the road. The rest was swallowed in black. I saw no one. The sound had stopped. I waited, straining my ears, staring at the darkness until my eyes ached. My own heartbeat was loud in my ears. I told myself maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was a branch falling or something shifting under the wood. I turned back toward the creek, but my nerves were awake now. Then it came again. Footsteps, but closer this time, more certain. I spun around, and I thought I saw something move just at the edge of the light, like a shape stepping back into the dark. It wasn't clear, just a suggestion of someone there. My mouth was dry, my hands gripping the railing, so hard my knuckles hurt. I stared into the dark for what felt like forever. I told myself to walk back to the car. Just get in, lock the doors, and go home. That was all I needed to do. But for some reason I hesitated. I took a few steps, my shoes loud on the wood, and as I moved, I heard it again, footsteps behind me, matching mine, only stopping when I stopped. My skin prickled all over. I didn't want to look back anymore. I walked faster, the sound behind me matching every step until I reached the car. I yanked the door open and slid inside, slamming it shut. My breathing was uneven, shallow. I locked the doors, turned off the headlights for a second to see if anything was out there. Darkness swallowed everything. When I flicked the lights back on, the road ahead was empty. No one was there. My stomach twisted. I sat there for a few minutes, telling myself it was nothing. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement on the passenger side, just beyond the glow of the lights. A figure. Not close enough to see clearly, but close enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. It stood there, just at the edge, still as stone. I didn't move. I couldn't. My hands clutched the wheel, my body frozen. Finally, I forced myself to start the car. The engine roared too loud in the quiet, and as soon as I shifted into gear, I saw the figure move. Not toward me, but back into the trees, disappearing as if it had been waiting only for me to see it. My chest was tight, and I pressed the gas harder than I should have. The car shot forward, gravel spitting under the tires as I tore down the road. The drive back felt endless. Every shadow on the roadside looked like someone standing there. My eyes darted back and forth, catching shapes that dissolved into trees, into nothing. My grip on the steering wheel made my fingers ache. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me, or worse, someone sitting in the back seat. When I finally hit the main road, I didn't slow down. I drove until I saw the glow of houses, until the silence outside my car was broken by the normal sounds of people living. Only then did I let myself breathe in long, shaky gasps. My chest hurt from holding it in so long. At home, I parked right in front of my door. I sat there for a long time before getting out. I scanned the street, every dark corner, every shadow. My own yard felt unfamiliar, wrong. I got inside fast, locked the door, checked the windows twice. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside made my heart race. When I finally did drift off, I woke up sweating, thinking I'd heard footsteps outside my window. In the morning, I told myself it had just been nerves, my imagination feeding on silence and darkness. But when I looked at the dust and gravel by my car, I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. Larger. Deeper. They circled the car, slow, deliberate. They led off toward the trees, then vanished into the grass. I didn't go back to that bridge. I never even took that road again. And even now, years later, I can still hear those footsteps in my head, slow and heavy, matching mine step for step in the dark. I never thought a simple plan to spend time outdoors would turn into something that stayed with me for years, but that is how it happened. I decided one weekend to take a solo trip into the woods. It wasn't supposed to be anything dangerous or extreme, just a quiet retreat away from noise and people. I packed enough food, water, and gear to last for a few days. My tent, sleeping bag, and a small camping stove were all I needed. I liked the idea of being surrounded by trees, listening to the sounds of the forest instead of traffic. It was late summer, warm during the day but cooler at night, and the weather forecast showed nothing unusual, just calm skies. I thought it would be peaceful. The drive out to the forest took almost 3 hours. The last stretch was a rough dirt road, full of dips and rocks that slowed me down. When I finally parked, the trailhead was quiet, no other cars in sight. That meant I would likely have the area to myself, which at the time felt like a gift. I tightened the straps on my pack, double-checked my water bottles, and started walking. The trail was narrow, lined with thick brush and tall pines that blocked out most of the sun. After about an hour, I could barely hear anything except my own footsteps and the occasional call of a bird. I went deeper, past a bend where the trail split, and followed the smaller path. This section felt more isolated, the trees growing closer together, the air cooler. After another half hour, I found a flat clearing next to a small stream. The ground was even, soft with pine needles, and there was enough space to pitch my tent. The stream would provide water for cleaning and maybe fishing if I wanted. It seemed perfect. I dropped my pack, stretched my legs, and set up camp. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some food, sat by a small fire, and listened to the forest. Crickets filled the air with their rhythm, and every once in a while a branch cracked in the distance. Normal sounds, nothing alarming. When I climbed into my sleeping bag, the stillness felt heavy but not threatening. I slept better than I expected. The second day, I explored further up the trail. I followed the stream until it widened into a shallow pool, where deer tracks pressed into the mud. I saw no other people, not even signs of anyone passing through recently. The solitude was calming. By evening, I was tired from walking and returned to camp. I gathered firewood and cooked again. It was quiet, too quiet at times, but I told myself that was the point of coming out here. That night, as I lay in my tent, I heard something new. It started faint, like a dragging sound against the ground. I held still, thinking it might just be a branch falling or some animal moving around. But the sound grew closer, deliberate, as if something heavy was being pulled. My heart sped up. I turned off my lantern and listened. The dragging paused, then started again, slower this time, coming from the direction of the trees behind my tent. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. After several minutes, the sound stopped completely. I waited longer, straining my ears. Nothing. Finally, I convinced myself it must have been an animal, maybe a deer caught in some brush. I tried to relax, though it took hours before I fell asleep again. The third morning, I woke up unsettled. The ground near the back of my tent looked disturbed, pine needles pushed aside in uneven patterns. It was the kind of trail something would leave if it had been dragged. I crouched and studied the marks, following them a few feet until they disappeared into the thicker brush. No footprints, nothing clear enough to identify. My stomach felt tight as I stood there. I tried to reason with myself. It was probably a wild animal moving through during the night, nothing more. But the thought of dragging stayed with me. I spent the day walking in the opposite direction of the marks. I didn't want to think too much about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I checked my watch often, waiting for evening so I could just make a fire and distract myself with cooking. By the time darkness fell, I was exhausted. I lit the fire, ate quickly, and sat with my back against a log, staring into the flames. The woods behind me felt alive, like unseen eyes were fixed on me. Every snap of a twig made me tense. That night was worse. Around midnight, I woke to the sound again. The dragging. Slow, steady, closer than before. I sat up inside my tent, holding my breath. My fire had burned down to embers, so the forest was nearly pitch black outside. The sound circled, moving around the edge of my campsite. My heart pounded so hard I thought whatever was out there could hear it. Then it stopped. The silence was heavier than the sound itself. Minutes passed, then I heard something new, the sound of water being disturbed. The stream. It splashed lightly, as if something large was moving in it, maybe kneeling, maybe washing. I couldn't stand it anymore. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. The moonlight gave faint outlines, shadows of trees and rocks. I saw movement near the stream, low to the ground, but I couldn't make out details. I shut the zipper quietly and sat in the dark, gripping the knife I kept in my pack. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside and checked the stream. The mud at the edge was churned up, prints pressed deep, though they were smeared and unrecognizable. Some looked human, others animal-like, stretched in odd directions. The dragging marks led straight into the water. My chest tightened. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I thought about leaving immediately, but part of me didn't want to seem paranoid. I told myself it could still be explained by animals, maybe even more than one. But I packed my gear anyway, just in case. I planned to leave the next morning. I thought one more day wouldn't hurt. That last night was the worst of all. I made no fire, not wanting to draw attention. I sat in the dark with my back against my pack, knife in hand, listening. Hours passed. The forest was strangely quiet, no crickets, no owls, as if everything was holding its breath. Then it began again. The dragging. This time, it came directly from the trail, approaching steadily. My pulse raced. I gripped the knife so hard my hand ached. The sound stopped only a few feet from my tent. I could hear breathing, low and rough, not like an animal panting but slower, heavier, controlled. I wanted to shout to scare it off, but fear locked my throat. The breathing lingered, steady, right outside. Then, as if it knew I was listening, it moved away. The dragging faded into the distance until it was gone. At first light, I didn't hesitate. I tore down my tent, stuffed everything into my pack, and left. I didn't even stop to eat. I walked fast, almost jogging, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The trail felt endless, the trees closing in around me. Every sound made me flinch, convinced something was behind me. By the time I reached my car, I was soaked in sweat and shaking. When I slammed the door shut and locked it, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I sat there for several minutes, staring at the tree line, waiting for something to appear. Nothing did. I turned the key, started the engine, and drove without stopping until I reached the main highway. Even now, I don't know what it was. Maybe a person, maybe something else, but not anything supernatural, just real and present. The dragging, the breathing, the marks in the mud. It was enough to convince me never to camp alone again. The woods are beautiful, but I learned how quickly they can turn from calm to something that makes you feel hunted. The sound of dragging through pine needles still lives in my memory, and I know if I ever hear it again, I won't stick around to find out what's making it. It was late summer when I decided to take a short break from everything and spend a weekend out in the woods by myself. I had been working nonstop for months, and I felt like I needed to clear my head. I had camped plenty of times before, but usually with friends or family. Going alone wasn't something I had done much, but I felt like it would give me the silence I wanted. I packed up my gear, made sure I had enough food, water, and supplies, and drove out to a remote forest area that I had read about. It was supposed to be quiet, not too many people went there, and it had some old trails that weren't kept up anymore. That was exactly what I wanted: space, silence, and no distractions. By the time I reached the gravel road that wound its way deeper into the woods, the sun was already starting to lower in the sky. The late afternoon light made everything glow with that orange warmth that makes you feel calm. The gravel popped under my tires as I drove, and the trees grew denser on either side. I found a small clearing a few hundred yards off the main path, not an official campsite, but flat enough to set up my tent. I parked my car nearby, carried my gear over, and got to work. I laid down the tarp, pitched my tent, and set up a small fire ring out of rocks I found around the clearing. I was sweating by the time I finished, but it felt good. The air smelled like pine and dirt, and the breeze kept it from being too hot. Once everything was in place, I made a simple dinner, heated a can of soup, and ate while listening to the forest. The quiet was deeper than I expected. No cars, no voices, not even distant sounds of farms or towns. Just wind through leaves, insects buzzing, and every now and then the snap of a twig as something small moved around. I sat there until it got dark enough that I had to turn on my lantern. That's when the forest changed. In daylight it felt calm, but in darkness it felt heavier, like the trees were closing in around me. The shadows seemed thicker, and every sound carried farther. I reminded myself that I was fine, that I had camped before, and that nothing was out there except maybe deer or raccoons. I put out the fire, climbed into my tent, and stretched out on my sleeping bag. The night air was cooler, and the nylon of the tent flapped softly as the wind moved across it. I left the rainfly open so I could see a slice of sky and stars through the mesh. At first I relaxed quickly, but then I noticed that the forest noises didn't stay steady. They came in waves. Sometimes there were crickets and rustling, then suddenly silence, then the noises would return. Each time the silence hit, I found myself holding my breath, waiting for something. I told myself it was normal, that animals pause, that wind shifts, but it kept happening. Long stretches of stillness followed by bursts of sound. I fell asleep uneasy. In the middle of the night, I woke up. At first I thought it was because I was cold, but then I realized I had heard something. It wasn't close, but it was steady, almost like a rhythm. A faint crunching. Footsteps. I froze in place and just listened. They didn't sound heavy like a bear, and they didn't scatter around like a deer. It was slow, one step at a time, breaking twigs and pressing down leaves. I held my breath and waited. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I kept listening, straining my ears so hard they almost hurt, but there was nothing. Slowly, the forest sounds returned, and I told myself maybe it had been an animal. I rolled over, though sleep didn't come easily again. My body stayed tense until morning. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I got up, made coffee, and walked a little way down the old trail that ran behind my clearing. The path was narrow and half overgrown, and the deeper I went, the more it felt like no one had been there in years. The trees closed in, blocking most of the sunlight, and the air felt cooler. I followed it for about half a mile before I decided to head back. There weren't any clear signs of people, just deer tracks and some fallen branches. Still, as I walked, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder now and then. I never saw anything, but I couldn't get rid of that thought of footsteps from the night before. The afternoon went by slowly. I sat around, read a book I had brought, and walked the edges of the clearing to gather more firewood. The sun dropped again, and I lit another small fire. The forest grew loud with insects, and I watched the flames for a long time. Once again, though, the night brought unease. When I finally turned in, I told myself I was overthinking things. But sometime after midnight, I woke again. This time the sound was closer. Distinct. Definite footsteps. My heart pounded as I lay still, not daring to move. The steps weren't circling the tent, but they were near the edge of the clearing, slow and deliberate. Crunch, pause, crunch. I tried to tell myself it was an animal again, but the spacing was too even, too much like a person walking. Then it stopped. Nothing. Just silence. I stayed awake for hours, every muscle in my body tight, until exhaustion finally pulled me under. By morning, I felt drained. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me stubbornly didn't want to give up. I told myself I had food, water, and daylight. I could handle one more day. To shake the feeling, I hiked farther down the trail during daylight. I went nearly 2 miles this time, climbing over logs and pushing through brush. Still, there was nothing unusual. No campsites, no signs of people. Just the thick, endless trees. When I turned back, I noticed how quiet it was. Even during the day, the deeper part of the forest seemed muffled, like sound didn't carry right. It made me uneasy all over again. By the time I got back, sweat was soaking my shirt, and the relief of seeing my little camp surprised me. That evening, I cooked the last of my food over the fire and sat staring into the flames. I told myself again that I'd leave in the morning, but deep down I wasn't sure if I'd even sleep that night. I let the fire burn low, climbed into the tent, and lay down. Hours later, I woke to something that froze me completely. The sound wasn't distant this time. It was right outside the tent. Slow, steady steps circling. I could hear the crunch of leaves just feet away. Then there was a pause, and the nylon of the tent shifted slightly, like something brushed against it. My heart slammed in my chest so hard it almost hurt. I stayed still, barely breathing. Another sound followed, a soft exhale, steady and controlled, like someone was standing there breathing just outside. Then silence again. Long, stretching silence. I stared at the thin wall of fabric separating me from whatever was out there. I didn't move until dawn light started to seep in. As soon as it was light enough, I unzipped the tent and scanned the clearing. Nothing. No one. But when I walked the edge, I saw it. Faint impressions in the ground. Not boots, not shoes. Bare feet. The prints were uneven, like someone had been moving slowly, circling. My stomach turned cold. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. No houses, no nearby campsites, nothing but miles of woods. I packed everything in record time, shoving gear into my bag without care for order. My hands shook as I tore down the tent. I hauled everything to my car, threw it in the back, and started the engine as fast as I could. The gravel road stretched out, the trees crowding around it, and I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. No one did. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, back in range of other people. Even now, I think about those prints. The slow, deliberate steps circling my tent. The breathing just outside. Whoever it was, they hadn't tried to talk, hadn't tried to make themselves known. They just watched, moving in silence through the trees, night after night. And the scariest part is not knowing if they would have kept waiting, if I had stayed just one more night. I never thought a simple walk in the woods would turn into one of the most unsettling nights of my life. It started as something so ordinary, just a late afternoon hike to clear my head, something I had done dozens of times before. The trail wasn't far from where I lived, a narrow dirt path that wound its way into the forest behind the fields. I had always liked that place because it was quiet, away from the sound of cars and people, the kind of spot where you could just hear the wind moving through the branches and the crunch of your own steps. That day had been warm, but by the time I set out, the air had cooled and there was a dampness that clung to everything. The sky was pale and overcast, with the sun sinking fast, its light dimming behind the gray clouds. I had no real plan, just to walk for a while and then turn back. My boots sank slightly into the soft earth as I moved deeper, passing familiar trees, moss-covered stumps, and the same old wooden sign that marked the start of the trail. The forest always had this way of making me feel both calm and alert at the same time. The stillness, the shadows, the way the leaves rattled like whispers, it made me listen to everything more closely. At first, it was peaceful. I kicked a few fallen branches out of my path, stepped over roots that stuck up like knotted ropes, and let the cool air clear my thoughts. The smell of damp soil and wet leaves hung in the air. But the deeper I went, the more I noticed how quiet it was. Normally, I would hear birds or the rustle of squirrels, but this time there was nothing. Just silence, thick and pressing, the kind that made the back of my neck prickle. I slowed down, trying to convince myself it was just the time of day. Maybe the animals had settled down for the evening. Still, it was strange enough to make me more aware of each sound my boots made. About half an hour in, I realized I had gone further than I meant to. The trees grew closer together here, taller and darker, the trail narrowing as it cut through. I told myself I'd walk for another 5 minutes and then head back before it got too dark. But then I noticed something odd. Up ahead, just barely visible through the trees, was movement, something tall, moving along the ridge of a slope about a couple 100 feet away. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, but the figure didn't stop, didn't glance around, just walked in a straight line across the top of the ridge. There was something about the way it moved that unsettled me. The steps were steady, unbroken, like it had no reason to slow down or look around. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it as long as I could before it disappeared over the other side. A small knot of unease tightened in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just someone else out here before nightfall, but the forest felt different now. I decided that was enough for the day and turned to head back. My pace was quicker this time, my eyes flicking to the sides of the trail more often than before. Not long after, I stopped to gather a few sticks and small branches for firewood. It was a habit I had, even when I wasn't camping, bringing some home to dry and burn in the backyard pit. I crouched just inside the edge of the trees, picking up pieces that weren't too damp, stacking them under one arm. That's when I heard it. A sound, faint at first, like heavy breathing. Slow, drawn out, coming from behind me. I froze where I was, hunched down, the wood pressing awkwardly against my arm. The sound was too deliberate to be the wind, too close to be anything else. My heart started hammering. I turned my head slightly, eyes searching the shadows between the trees. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then I caught the slightest shift, movement deeper in the forest. I couldn't make out a shape clearly, but something was there. The breathing grew heavier, then started to fade, like it was moving away. That was enough for me. I dropped half the wood without caring, clutching the rest against my chest as I stood up fast. My legs carried me back toward the trail before my mind had even caught up. I didn't look back right away, afraid of what I might see, but the feeling of being watched stuck with me, sharp and certain. When I finally dared to glance over my shoulder, the trees behind me were just shadows, still and silent. But I didn't slow down. I moved as quickly as I could along the narrow path, my breath short and hard, every small sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, making me flinch. The woods felt endless, the trail stretching longer than I remembered. I kept my eyes locked on the ground ahead, following the worn dirt path like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to safety. By the time I saw the first signs of the clearing near the start, my hands were trembling from gripping the sticks so tightly. When I stepped out into the open field again, the sky was darker, the last bit of daylight slipping away. The open space gave me a small relief, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I turned around one last time, staring at the dark line of trees. Nothing moved, nothing stirred, but I knew what I had heard, what I had felt in those woods. I didn't stop until I was home, the door shut and locked behind me. Even then, the image of that figure on the ridge, the sound of that breathing in the dark, stayed with me. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was just some stranger out walking, maybe an animal I couldn't see. But deep down, I knew there had been something in those trees that wasn't just passing by. Something that had noticed me. Something that had been close enough to breathe behind me. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how small and quiet the woods had felt when I first stepped into them, how safe they had seemed. But now I knew better. I knew how fast peace could turn to dread when the silence stretches too long, when the shadows seem to move, and when you realize you aren't as alone as you thought. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I looked out toward the tree line from my backyard, I half expected to see that figure again, moving along the ridge. I never did, but the thought stuck with me. I had always thought of the forest as familiar, harmless, just another place to walk. But now, every time I step near those trees, I carry that night with me. The sound of unseen breathing, the movement I couldn't explain, and the knowledge that sometimes, in the quietest places, you aren't nearly as alone as you think. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend away from everything, so I packed up my small camping gear and drove out to a piece of land I knew about, a stretch of field pressed right up against a forest that went on for miles. I had been there before during the day, but never at night, and I wanted to see what it felt like to stay out there alone. I thought I was ready for the silence, for the darkness, for the way the woods could feel different when the sun went down. I parked at the edge of the field and walked the rest of the way in with my pack, the late afternoon light stretching shadows across the ground. The grass brushed against my legs as I made my way closer to the tree line, the smell of pine and dirt already heavier than in the city. By the time I had my tent set up, the sun was dropping fast. The field was empty and wide, but the forest just beyond it seemed to swallow up the light quicker than the open land did. The air cooled, and a quiet breeze bent the grass in waves. I started a small fire, gathered enough wood to keep it burning for a while, and sat there listening to the crackling. The quiet wasn't total. There were the faint calls of birds settling down, the high chirps of crickets, and every now and then the shifting sound of something moving in the woods. At first it was easy to dismiss, just small animals moving through the underbrush, nothing unusual. But the longer I sat there, the more I noticed how every sound stood out sharply, how each rustle seemed closer than I wanted it to be. When it was fully dark, I leaned back and looked at the ridge of a hill that rose up maybe 200 feet away from the field. The firelight only reached so far, so beyond the glow was nothing but a dark shape of grass and trees against the sky. As I watched it, I noticed movement. A figure, a dark shape against the darker ridge, was walking across it. I froze, staring. It was upright, moving steady, not stopping to look around, not stumbling like an animal might. The distance made it hard to see details, but the way it moved was clear. Someone was up there, walking across the ridge, as if they knew exactly where they were going. I waited, expecting them to turn, to pause, to maybe stop and look down into the field, but they never did. They just kept walking, smooth and steady, until they disappeared over the far side of the hill. I sat there for a long time, staring at the ridge. The fire popped and hissed behind me, but I barely noticed. I thought maybe it was just a hiker heading back before it got too late, but something about the way they moved bothered me. There was no hesitation, no flashlight, no stumble. Just a straight line across the ridge into the dark. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. The longer I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. After a while, I needed more wood for the fire. The stack I had gathered wasn't going to last through the night, so I grabbed my small flashlight and walked toward the edge of the forest. The beam cut a thin line through the trees, lighting up trunks, branches, and patches of dirt. The woods felt tight, the trees pressing in on all sides, every sound sharper in the dark. I started picking up sticks and branches, carrying them back and forth. On one of my trips, I heard something behind me. At first it was faint, almost like wind shifting through leaves, but then I caught it more clearly. Heavy breathing. It was slow, deep, and uneven, the kind of sound a person makes when they're close but trying not to be noticed. My whole body went cold. I turned slowly, shining the flashlight behind me. The beam lit up nothing but tree trunks and branches, shadows stretching long and thin. But in between them, I caught just the faintest trace of movement, something slipping from one tree to another. The breathing continued, though now it was drifting further away, fading into the deeper woods. My chest tightened as I tried to listen, trying to tell myself it was just an animal. But animals didn't breathe like that, not in steady, heavy bursts that sounded almost human. I dropped the wood I had gathered and ran back to the tent, the flashlight bouncing in my hand, the beam catching glimpses of trees as I moved. When I reached the fire, I stopped and turned, heart pounding, staring at the edge of the woods. Nothing followed. The forest looked still, silent except for the usual night sounds. But I couldn't shake the image of that shape moving between the trees, couldn't shake the sound of that breathing fading away. I sat by the fire for a long time, not moving, just listening. Every pop of the fire made me jump. I thought about the figure on the ridge, how it had moved without stopping, how it had disappeared into the dark. Then I thought about the breathing in the woods, the way it had been close, too close, before slipping away. I kept the fire high, feeding it more than I needed to, not daring to let it die down. At some point, exhaustion set in. My eyes grew heavy, and the night dragged on. I got into the tent, but left the fire burning, the glow flickering through the thin fabric. I lay there with every muscle tense, listening to the night. The breathing didn't come back, and nothing moved outside that I could hear. Eventually, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. When the morning came, I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the field. The fire was nothing but ash and faint smoke. The ridge stood quiet, the grass still, the woods thick and silent under the daylight. I walked slowly to the edge of the trees, looking for any sign of tracks, any broken branches or disturbed dirt that might show what had been there. I found nothing. The ground looked undisturbed, just like it had the day before. I packed up quickly, stuffing everything back into my bag. The whole place felt different now, less like a quiet escape and more like something I didn't belong in. As I walked back toward where I had parked, I kept glancing over my shoulder at the ridge. The image of that dark figure stayed in my head, the way it had crossed without hesitation, the way it hadn't stopped to look. Driving away, I kept thinking about the breathing. The sound had been close, close enough that if I had stood there a few seconds longer, I might have seen what made it. It hadn't been the wind, and it hadn't been an animal. Someone had been there, moving just far enough away to keep hidden. Even now, I can still picture it. The ridge at night, the figure walking across it without a pause, and the woods where something breathed heavy in the dark just a few steps behind me. I'll never know who it was, or why they were out there, or why they didn't come closer. But I know they were there, and I know I'll never camp alone in that field again. It started as a normal weekend trip, the kind of plan that comes together on short notice and feels casual, almost careless, like nothing bad could come from it. I had been restless for days, itching to get out of the city, away from the noise, the routine, the same streets I saw every day. I packed quickly, tossing my tent, sleeping bag, and some food into the trunk of my car. I didn't overthink anything, didn't bother to tell too many people where I was going, just said I'd be out in the hills for a couple of nights and back by Sunday. I picked a spot I'd been to once before, years earlier, a small pull-off by a dirt road that led down into a valley where a creek wound between ridges. It was quiet, far from any towns, and usually empty. I liked it for that reason. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sun was already sinking low, spilling long shadows across the dry grass fields. The gravel under my tires crunched loudly, the sound echoing in the otherwise still evening. I parked near a clearing, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the silence that followed. No cars, no voices, not even a plane overhead. Just the soft whistle of wind moving through the trees and the fading cries of birds settling down for the night. I got out and stretched, feeling that weightless calm that comes from stepping out into open space after being trapped on the road for hours. I walked the area before setting up camp. The clearing was surrounded on three sides by tall pine and oak trees, their dark trunks leaning close together like they were guarding the valley. To the west, the land dipped steeply down toward the creek. You could hear it faintly if you stood still, just a low rush of water moving over rocks. The grass around the clearing was high and dry, the stalks brittle under my boots. A few old fire rings were scattered near the treeline, blackened circles of ash from whoever had camped here before. No fresh signs of people, though. No tire tracks, no wrappers, no cut branches. It felt untouched, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of how alone you really are. I pitched my tent near the edge of the trees, just far enough in to feel sheltered, but still open to the clearing. The ground was flat there, packed dirt covered in a layer of pine needles. I stacked some wood for a fire and got it going before the light fully disappeared. The flames rose quickly, popping and throwing sparks into the cooling air. I heated up a simple meal, ate, and leaned back against my pack, watching the last strip of sunset fade from pink to gray. The sky darkened slowly, the first stars pricking through above me. As the fire burned lower, the night settled in heavier. The sounds of the forest shifted, day creatures fading out, night creatures taking their place. Crickets chirped steadily. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted. I felt comfortable, but also a little on edge, that natural awareness you get when you're alone in the woods and every crack of a branch sounds bigger than it probably is. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the usual noise of the night. I finally crawled into the tent and zipped myself in. The air inside was warm from the fire's leftover heat. I lay there, listening to the fabric ripple faintly with the breeze. I must have drifted off at some point, but I woke suddenly, unsure what had stirred me. The fire had burned almost all the way down, just a faint orange glow outside. The crickets had stopped. It was the silence that pulled me fully awake. The kind of silence where you realize every living thing nearby has gone still. I stayed frozen, listening hard. At first, I heard nothing but the faint rush of the creek below. Then, a sound carried faintly up the slope, heavy, deliberate movement, like someone walking through brush. Slow, steady steps. They weren't far away. My heart jumped, pounding in my chest. I strained to figure out if it was just an animal. The weight of the steps didn't sound like a deer, which usually moved lighter and faster. This was heavier, dragging a little, crunching twigs as it moved. The sound circled, not directly toward me at first, but moving across the slope, then pausing, then shifting again. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a bear, maybe an elk. But the rhythm of it was wrong. Too even, too much like footsteps. Minutes stretched, each one dragging longer than the last. I heard another crack, closer this time, up near the ridge above the clearing. My skin prickled. I unzipped the tent slowly, just enough to peek out. The fire had died completely now, leaving only faint white smoke. The clearing was dim, lit only by the stars and a thin slice of moon. I couldn't see anyone, but I swore I felt movement at the edge of the trees. I slipped fully out, moving as quietly as I could. I stood still, scanning the shadows, but nothing shifted. Then, from the opposite side of the clearing, another branch snapped. It was farther than I thought, like whoever, or whatever it was, had circled me completely. My stomach twisted. I wanted to call out, but my throat felt locked. Instead, I crouched near the dying fire, reaching for a long piece of wood and poking it at the embers until flames licked up again. The light pushed the darkness back a little, but it didn't make me feel safer. The noises faded after that. No more steps. No more cracks. Just the slow return of crickets. I tried to stay awake, sitting by the fire, watching the trees, but exhaustion pulled me under again. I told myself I was imagining it, that tiredness was making me jumpy. The next morning, I woke stiff and groggy, but the clearing was quiet and normal again. Sunlight streamed through the trees. Birds were calling. I convinced myself it had been nothing, just the mind playing tricks in the dark. I shook off the unease, made breakfast, and decided to hike down to the creek for water. The trail sloped steeply, loose dirt and rocks sliding under my boots. The creek was clearer and faster than I remembered, sunlight flashing off the surface. I filled my bottles, then sat for a while, listening to the water. When I finally started back up, I noticed something in the dirt along the trail. A print. At first, I thought it was just an animal track, but the longer I looked, the less certain I was. It wasn't clear, the edges smeared, but it was long, almost like a boot had pressed down into the soil. I told myself hikers used the trail too, though I hadn't seen anyone. I pushed the thought aside and returned to camp. But the unease lingered. I kept glancing at the treeline, expecting movement. Nothing came, but I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been out there. By the second night, I was more alert. I built the fire bigger, stacked more wood within reach. I set my flashlight by my side. When I finally climbed into the tent, I left the zipper halfway open so I could look out. It didn't take long. Sometime past midnight, the noises returned. Soft at first, then clearer. Steps again, heavier than any deer or small animal. My body went cold. The steps moved slowly around the clearing, just at the edge of the firelight. I strained to see, but every time I thought I caught movement, it vanished into shadow. The steps stopped for long stretches, then started again from a different angle. It was like someone was pacing the perimeter, circling me, watching. I didn't sleep. I sat there in the tent, gripping the flashlight, listening, waiting. Hours passed. At some point, I realized there was more than one set of steps. One to the north, another to the west. Two figures moving separately, but never coming close. When dawn finally broke, the noises vanished again. The forest returned to normal. Birds calling, branches shifting. I climbed out, stiff and shaky. My firewood pile had been knocked over. At first, I thought maybe wind had done it, but the way the pieces were scattered, some farther than they should have been, made me doubt that. I packed quickly, every movement sharp with urgency. I didn't want to be there another night. I stuffed the tent, the bag, everything into the trunk without care. As I drove back up the dirt road, I caught sight of something in my rearview mirror. A figure, half hidden between the trees, standing still, watching the road as I left. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back again. I just drove, gravel spitting behind me, my hands tight on the wheel. Even now, I don't know who they were, or what they wanted. All I know is they were there, watching me in the dark, circling my camp like they had all the time in the world. I left before I could find out what would have happened if I'd stayed. And I will never camp alone in that valley again. I had been planning the trip for weeks, telling myself I needed to get away from the noise of the city. The idea of being out in nature always sounded peaceful when I sat in my apartment, surrounded by traffic sounds and neighbors' televisions bleeding through the walls. I picked a place far enough from the main road that I wouldn't hear cars, but close enough that I could still walk back if anything went wrong. It was a flat clearing tucked against a dense stretch of woods, the kind of spot that felt quiet the second you stepped into it. The day I left, the weather was mild, clear skies with a faint breeze. I packed what I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, food for 2 days, flashlight, spare batteries, and my old hunting knife I never really used. It wasn't meant to be some survivalist thing, just a couple nights away where I could hear my own thoughts without someone else's noise pressing into me. When I first got there, the place felt perfect. The clearing opened up enough to let the sunlight pour in, but the forest line wrapped tight around 3 sides like a dark wall. The grass was tall but patchy, flattened in spots from deer or maybe people passing through long before me. I set my tent closer to the edge, telling myself it would give me shade when the sun moved lower. The first day passed quietly. I collected some wood, started a small fire, and just sat, letting my eyes wander across the treeline. The silence was heavier than I expected. I thought I would hear birds or insects all the time, but there were long stretches where it was nothing but the faint rustle of wind in leaves. Every now and then, a crow cut through the stillness with a sharp caw, and the sound felt almost too loud for the space. By the time the sun began to sink, I felt calm. The air cooled, the fire crackled, and I stretched out on my camp chair, watching the sky fade to deep orange and then blue. The woods darkened quick, shadows spreading until the tree line became one thick black wall. I ate my dinner, canned beans and bread, slowly, not in a rush to do anything. When night fell completely, I noticed how different the clearing felt. The space that had felt wide and open during the day now seemed small, pressed in by the darkness of the forest. My firelight reached only a short distance, casting shapes that twitched and shifted with every flicker. I thought about the distance back to the road and realized it was farther than I remembered. The idea of walking it at night felt impossible, so I shoved the thought away. I was sitting there, staring at the fire, when I caught movement up on the ridge past the clearing. It was about 200 feet away, a rise that caught the moonlight just enough to outline it. At first I thought it was a trick of my eyes, but then I saw the shape again, something moving steady along the top. It didn't stop, didn't turn, just crossed smooth and slow until it dipped out of sight. I told myself it had to be a deer. That was the easiest answer. A lone deer slipping across the ridge, nothing unusual. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized how upright it had looked. I replayed it in my head, the way it moved, not like something on four legs. It had walked straight across, arms hanging, head forward, the way a person would. My stomach tightened. I stood up, staring at the ridge until my eyes burned from not blinking. Nothing moved again. The woods stayed quiet. No sound of brush snapping, no voice calling out, just the fire popping behind me. After a while, I forced myself to sit back down, telling myself again and again that it was nothing. The night dragged on, heavy and slow. I went into my tent finally, zipped it closed, and lay there listening. Every sound felt sharper than it should have. The wind pressing against the nylon, the crackle of the dying fire, even the faint sound of my own breathing filled the small space. Sleep came in broken pieces, light and restless. The next morning, the sun felt like a relief. Everything looked normal again. The ridge was empty, the woods calm, the fire nothing but ash. I tried to laugh at myself for how tense I had been, shaking my head at how quickly my brain went to the worst ideas in the dark. I spent the morning gathering wood deeper into the forest, carrying back armfuls until I had a solid pile for the night. Around midday, I boiled water, ate some noodles, and stretched out on the grass, trying to let the sun warm the nerves out of me. It wasn't until late afternoon that the feeling came back. I was maybe 30 yards inside the tree-line, hunting for branches, when I heard it breathing. It was faint at first, so faint I thought it was me, but then it grew clearer, heavier. A steady, thick sound, like someone standing just behind me. I froze, my arms full of sticks, ears straining. The sound was close, too close. I turned my head quick, scanning the trees, but I didn't see anyone, just trunks and shadows. The breathing shifted, softer now, like it was pulling back. My chest tightened, and I dropped half the sticks as I backed away, eyes darting. I swear I saw movement, something slipping between two trees farther off. Not a shape I could make out, just the faint shift of something large enough to disturb the space. The breathing followed, distant now, moving away. Panic shot through me. I dropped the rest of the sticks and ran, my legs crashing through brush until I broke out of the tree-line into the clearing. My chest burned, my breath short, but I didn't stop until I was at my tent. I stood there, staring at the forest, waiting to see something step out. Nothing did. The woods stood still, quiet as before. I stayed close to camp the rest of the day. My knife clipped at my side, though I knew it wouldn't matter much if someone really was out there. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe it was the same figure I had seen the night before, circling closer this time, letting me know I wasn't alone. When darkness came again, it felt heavier than before. I built my fire larger, piling wood high, trying to push back the shadows. Every flicker seemed to stretch strange, bending the clearing into a different shape. My eyes locked on the ridge again, waiting for movement. Hours passed, but nothing came. I sat stiff in my chair, gripping the flashlight, ears tuned for the sound of breathing again. My fire burned down slow, the wood collapsing into glowing coals. My nerves didn't ease until the sky began to pale, the sun pushing back the night. By the time I packed up the next morning, I felt hollow. I hadn't come out here to feel hunted. I folded the tent fast, shoved everything into my bag, and doused the fire until the ground was black and steaming. I didn't look back at the ridge. I didn't step into the woods for more sticks. I just left, walking fast, almost jogging until I hit the dirt road again. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors before I even set my pack down. My chest ached from how hard my heart had been pounding the whole way back. Sitting behind the wheel, I realized I never really saw who or what it was. I never got a clear look, just shapes, sounds, and that figure against the ridge. But the fear felt real, real enough that I knew I'd never camp there again. Driving home, the forest faded behind me, but the weight stayed. I kept thinking about the sound of that breathing, how close it had been, how it had followed just enough to let me know it was there. Whatever was out there that night, it didn't need to step into the clearing to scare me away. It just had to remind me that I wasn't as alone as I thought. And that was enough to make me never want to test it again. I had always liked being outdoors, but there are times when being too far away from people makes you realize how fragile you really are. That night still plays in my mind like it happened yesterday. I had gone camping by myself, out on the edge of a large patch of woods that stretched further than I could see in daylight. I had chosen the place because it was quiet, open enough for a tent and a small fire, and just far enough from the road that I wouldn't hear passing cars. I wanted peace, but what I found instead was something else entirely. The first part of the day had been calm. I set up my tent in the late afternoon, spread out my sleeping bag, stacked the firewood I had collected earlier, and ate some food I had packed in my bag. The weather was cool, dry, and there was no wind. Everything seemed perfect. The open field I camped in ran right up to the line of trees, and I remember thinking how dark those woods would get once the sun dropped. During the last bit of daylight, I walked a little into the forest to gather some extra branches and sticks. The deeper I went, the quieter it got, as if the trees swallowed up all the sound. Even my footsteps felt muffled by the thick carpet of old leaves and pine needles. I didn't stay long inside. Something about the silence pressed against my ears, and I hurried back out into the open where I could see the sky again. As evening came, I lit my fire. The crackling wood and the orange glow made me feel secure, like the flames themselves pushed back the emptiness of the night. Still, once the last bit of sunlight slipped behind the horizon, the trees changed. They weren't just trees anymore. The wall of branches and shadows turned into a black barrier, hiding everything that might be inside. I sat close to the fire, warming my hands, watching sparks float up and vanish. I tried not to look too much at the woods. Every time I did, my imagination painted shapes between the trunks, figures that weren't really there. It was around 9 when I first noticed something strange. At the top of the ridge across the field, a figure moved. The ridge wasn't close. It stood about 200 feet away, maybe more, but I could make out the shape of a person walking slowly across it. The figure was steady, never pausing, never turning. Just moving, straight across, like they had a destination on the other side. No flashlight, no sound, nothing. I watched them until they disappeared beyond the slope. At first, I thought maybe it was another camper, someone cutting across the ridge to get to a trail, but the way they moved was strange. Too smooth, too steady, like they weren't even paying attention to where they stepped. I shook the thought off and told myself it was nothing. Still, I couldn't stop glancing back at that ridge. The fire popped and hissed. The field around me glowed faintly in its light, but that dark line of trees and the empty hill stayed in my mind. I ate a little more food and tried to distract myself by staring at the flames, but my ears were tuned to the night now. I could hear everything: the chirp of insects, the distant hoot of an owl, the crack of a branch far off in the forest. Every sound stretched out, too loud, too clear. After a while, I needed more firewood. I knew I had to step back into the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the tree line. The air grew cooler under the branches, the smell of damp earth strong. My light cut a thin path through the trees, but beyond it everything was pitch black. I bent down and picked up fallen limbs, stacking them in my arm. That's when I heard it. Breathing. It wasn't mine. It was heavy, labored, like someone standing not far behind me, dragging air in and out of their lungs. My chest tightened instantly. I froze, listening. The sound didn't stop. Slow, steady breaths. I swung the flashlight around, pointing it between the trunks, but all I caught were broken branches and tangled brush. No clear shape, nothing solid. But there was movement, the faintest shift, like something sliding behind one of the trees. The breathing grew softer, fading away like whoever it was had turned and walked deeper into the forest. My heart pounded so hard I thought I'd drop the wood. I didn't wait to find out more. I turned, clutching the sticks, and hurried back to camp as fast as I could without running. My fire looked like salvation when it came back into view, the orange glow against the black field. I threw the wood down and sat close, staring at the woods. For the next hour, I couldn't shake the sound of that breathing. It had been too close, too real. I kept telling myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe even a bear moving through the trees. But animals don't breathe like that. That had been human deep, almost tired breathing, like someone who had followed me and then decided to walk away. The night dragged on. I tried lying down in my tent, but every rustle outside made my skin crawl. I stayed awake, listening, waiting. I thought about the figure on the ridge. I thought about that sound in the woods. My mind twisted the two together, building images I didn't want. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember was waking up to silence. No insects, no owl, no crackle of the fire. Just silence. I unzipped the tent slowly and peeked out. The fire had burned down to embers, glowing faintly in the ash. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the whole field was holding its breath. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. Then from the ridge, a sound. Not footsteps, not breathing this time, but the faint crunch of rocks, as if someone shifted their weight up there. I stared at the dark line, my heart thudding in my throat. The ridge was empty as far as I could see, but I knew I hadn't imagined the sound. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat with my knife in my lap, staring at the trees, waiting for morning. When the sun finally started to rise, the world felt alive again. Birds sang, insects buzzed, the frost softened in the light. The fear drained away with the darkness, but the memory of it stayed. Packing up, I walked to the edge of the forest where I had collected firewood. I looked for tracks, for any sign of who or what had been there. The ground was disturbed, leaves pushed aside, but nothing clear. Just the impression of weight, too heavy for a deer, too wide for one person. As I followed it a little deeper, I found what chilled me most. A broken branch about shoulder height, snapped clean, like someone had pushed through with force. Not an animal brushing by, but someone tall, someone strong. And near the base of the tree, a single footprint pressed into the soft dirt. A boot print. It wasn't mine. I stood there, staring at it, my mouth dry, the morning light shining down like nothing had happened. Whoever it was had been real. They had been close enough to watch me, close enough to breathe behind me. The thought made my stomach twist. I didn't stay any longer. I stuffed my things into my bag, kicked dirt over the fire pit, and left. As I walked back toward the road, I didn't look back at the ridge, didn't look at the trees. But I could feel it, the weight of eyes that had maybe been on me the whole time. When I finally reached the road and saw my car, relief washed over me like a wave. I started the engine and drove, gripping the wheel tighter than I needed to. The whole way back, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone walking along the roadside, keeping pace. Even now, I can still hear that breathing when I close my eyes. Heavy, slow, steady. Whoever was out there never showed themselves, never made a move toward me, but they didn't have to. The silence, the sound, the footprint, those were enough. It reminded me how easily someone can watch you without you knowing, how quickly safety can turn into danger in a place so empty. And the worst part is I'll never know what they wanted, or why they didn't step closer when they had the chance. That question keeps me awake, sometimes more than the memory itself. It's the not knowing that makes it impossible to forget. It started as an ordinary trip, the kind of thing that didn't feel dangerous at all when I was planning it. I had been wanting some time alone away from the noise of everything, and the idea of a long hike into the backwoods had been pulling at me for weeks. I packed everything I thought I'd need: a tent, sleeping bag, food supplies, water bottles, matches, a flashlight, extra batteries, a knife, and a small first aid kit. It all seemed enough. I had been camping before, but never this far away from towns and roads. That was part of the appeal. I wanted silence, the kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat at night. The trail started clear and wide, worn down by others who had walked it before. I followed it for miles, the crunch of dirt and gravel under my boots mixing with the occasional snap of twigs when I misstepped. The forest pressed in on both sides, tall pines rising up and blocking most of the sky, letting through only scattered patches of blue. The smell of pine needles was heavy in the air, earthy and sharp, and every now and then I caught the sound of a bird or the rustle of something moving low through the underbrush. I told myself it was squirrels or rabbits, nothing more. By the time the sun had lowered enough that shadows began to stretch long across the ground, I had reached a small clearing where the trees pulled back into a rough oval of open space. The grass was patchy, uneven, but there was enough room to set up a tent. I dropped my pack, my shoulders sore from the weight, and began laying everything out. The tent went up quickly. I staked it down, double-checked the seams, then built a small fire pit with stones I gathered from the edges of the clearing. Soon enough, I had flames licking up dry sticks, crackling softly as the sky turned orange and then purple. The forest grew quiet with the fading light. Birds stopped calling, the rustling eased, and I was left with the low crack of the fire and the faint whistle of wind moving between the trees. It was exactly what I had been craving: isolation. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, sat cross-legged in the dirt, and ate slowly, savoring the heat and the taste after the long day. I remember feeling a strange calm settle in me. No voices, no traffic, no buzzing phone. Just me, the fire, and the woods. But as night fell deeper, that calm started to shift. Darkness changes everything. When the last glow drained from the sky and the trees became nothing more than black walls pressing close, I realized how alone I really was. The clearing, which had seemed so open during the day, now felt like a trap. The firelight only pushed back the dark in a small circle. Beyond that, the woods were impenetrable, heavy, and silent. I found myself staring into that blackness, imagining shapes shifting between the trees, movements that I couldn't confirm. The silence broke once in a while. A stick snapped somewhere off in the distance, the sound sharp, almost deliberate. I froze every time, waiting, listening, but nothing followed. I told myself animals move at night. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a coyote. Still, I felt my body tense each time, my chest tight, my ears straining for the next sound. I crawled into the tent when the fire died low. I left a few embers burning, their faint glow visible through the fabric of the tent wall. Inside, it was stuffy but safe. I zipped the flap closed, slid into my sleeping bag, and tried to focus on breathing steady. Sleep didn't come easily. Every crunch outside, every shifting breeze against the tent, had me opening my eyes and staring at the fabric inches from my face. Hours seemed to crawl by, the night endless. Sometime past midnight, I heard it. Not just the crack of a branch, but heavy movement, closer than before. Leaves rustled, and then there was the sound of something stepping down hard enough that I felt the faintest vibration through the ground. I held my breath, my whole body frozen inside the sleeping bag. My ears picked up the rhythm. Step, pause. Slow, heavy. Not the quick scurry of an animal, not the light hopping of deer. Something bigger. I wanted to unzip the flap just a little, to peek out, but fear kept me pinned. I pictured shining eyes catching the last glow of the embers, some shape standing there at the edge of the clearing waiting. My mind went in every direction at once. A bear? A mountain lion? A person? Each idea made my chest tighten more. The steps stopped. For a long stretch of time, there was nothing. Just silence, thick and pressing, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I finally convinced myself it had been nothing, maybe just my imagination amplifying distant sounds. My muscles eased slightly, enough that I almost drifted into sleep. Then the breathing started. It was faint at first, so soft I thought it was just my own breath echoing in my ears. But it grew steady, deep, and slow. It was not mine. It was outside the tent, close, so close that I swore if I pushed my hand against the fabric, I would touch whatever was there. The sound moved, shifting around one side of the tent, then stopping again. I lay perfectly still, every nerve screaming. My heartbeat was so loud I thought it would give me away. The breathing stayed there, low and drawn out, for what felt like forever. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it faded. I strained to follow it, but the sound grew fainter, until there was nothing but the soft hum of the forest night. I don't know how long I stayed awake after that, staring wide-eyed into the black of the tent. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me under. The morning light was a relief I can't explain. The sun pushed through the trees, and everything felt different. Safe again. I unzipped the tent, blinking against the brightness, and stepped out into the clearing. The fire pit was cold, the grass wet with dew. For a few minutes, I let myself believe I had just dreamed it all. My nerves had played tricks, feeding me sounds in the dark. But then I saw the ground. Just beyond the tent, the grass was bent and pressed down in uneven patches. Not just from me. These were wide, uneven impressions, heavier than a deer's tracks, not clean like the paw prints of a dog. They circled the tent loosely, moving from one side to the other, then trailing back into the trees. I crouched there, staring at them, my stomach tightening. I told myself again it had to be an animal. Maybe a bear had wandered through, curious about the smell of food. That had to be it. But the weight of those steps in the night, the rhythm of them, and the slow, deliberate breathing, I couldn't shake it. I packed up quickly, my hands clumsy as I shoved everything back into my bag. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted to be moving, to put distance between myself and that clearing. The trail back felt longer than it had on the way in. Every sound made me turn my head, my eyes scanning the trees for movement. Once I thought I caught sight of something, a flash of dark between the trunks, low to the ground, but when I stopped and stared, there was nothing. By the time I finally reached the trailhead and saw the empty gravel lot where my car sat, I felt drained, my legs trembling. I threw my pack in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors before I even put the keys in the ignition. As I sat there, catching my breath, I looked back at the tree line one last time. The woods stood still, quiet, almost peaceful under the midday sun. But I knew what I had heard, what I had felt through the thin floor of the tent. Those weren't the sounds of a dream. Something had been there, close enough to breathe against the walls that separated me from it. Even now, thinking back, the detail that sticks with me most isn't the steps, or the tracks, or even the fear. It's the way the breathing slowed and deepened, as if whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. It was standing still, calm, like it had all the time in the world. And I still don't know if it was animal or human, but I know I won't camp alone again. I never thought a simple hike could turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. I had gone out alone, planning only a short day trip through a trail I had never been on before. It wasn't a remote wilderness far from everything, at least not at first. It started near a small state park, the kind of place families go for picnics or couples walk together for an afternoon. I had looked at the map posted at the trailhead, noticed the loops and side paths, and decided I'd take one of the longer ones since I had the whole day. I had water, some snacks, a jacket tied around my waist, and my phone in my pocket. I didn't think I needed much else. The weather was mild, not too hot, not too cold, with enough sun to make the woods seem inviting. The first part of the hike was easy. The path was well-worn, with wooden signs pointing out the different routes. I passed a few people early on, dog walkers and joggers, but soon the trail split into a narrower section, and I noticed how quickly the noise of the main area faded away. The sound of kids laughing by the picnic tables disappeared, and it was replaced by the crunch of my shoes on dirt and the constant chatter of birds hidden in the trees. The woods weren't dark at first, just quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy after a while. The deeper I went, the more the trail seemed less traveled. The dirt path thinned into a strip with weeds brushing against my legs. Fallen branches blocked parts of it, and I had to step over or around them. I felt more isolated, and the only sound besides my footsteps was the occasional rustling of squirrels darting through the undergrowth. At first, it was calming, even peaceful, like I had the entire forest to myself. But as the hours passed, that same quiet started to feel different. The trees grew closer together, and the sunlight came through in broken patches instead of wide beams. I noticed how still the air was. Every time I stopped to take a drink of water, I realized how little I heard. No birds, no bugs buzzing close to my ears, no distant hum of cars. Just silence. It felt unnatural, but I told myself it was probably just this section of the woods. I checked my phone for the time and the map. There was barely any signal, but the GPS worked enough to show a blue dot moving along the path. I thought I was fine. I thought I knew exactly where I was. That confidence didn't last long. At some point, the trail I was following forked into two. The signpost that should have been there was gone, broken off at the base, leaving only splinters sticking out of the dirt. I stared at the two paths. The one on the left sloped down slightly, the one on the right curved uphill. Both looked about the same. I told myself it didn't matter, that both would meet up again eventually. I chose the one on the left. That decision would haunt me for hours. The trail went downhill and grew muddier. My shoes slipped more than once, and the trees pressed so close together that the sunlight almost disappeared. I realized then how far I had gone without seeing another person. Not a jogger, not a hiker, not even an old fire ring that would prove someone had camped there. Just endless trees and the sound of my own breathing. I told myself not to worry, that the trail would circle back. But the deeper I went, the less it looked like a trail at all. Branches reached across the path, snagging at my jacket. Roots rose out of the ground like they wanted to trip me. The mud grew thicker, sticking to my shoes until they felt heavy. I stopped once to catch my breath, and that was when I heard it. It was faint at first, just a crunch, almost like another pair of footsteps behind me. I turned so fast that I nearly slipped, but there was nothing. Just the path, the trees, the silence. I held my breath, waiting, but the sound didn't repeat. I told myself it was probably just a branch falling, or maybe a deer moving away. Still, I felt exposed standing there, so I started walking again, faster this time. The woods only grew darker. It wasn't night yet, but the sun was lowering, and with the dense trees blocking most of the light, it felt like evening already. My sense of direction faltered. I tried to use my phone, but the GPS that had stopped moving, frozen in place. The map wouldn't refresh. I felt the first real stab of panic then, realizing how alone I was. The footsteps came again, this time closer. I spun around, heart pounding, and stared into the trees. Something shifted in the distance. It wasn't clear, just movement, a darker shadow among the trunks. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a deer. It was too tall, too upright. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but when I looked harder, there was nothing there. Just emptiness. I started moving again, forcing my legs into a faster pace, but every few minutes, I swore I heard it again. A step, then another, matching mine, pausing when I paused. The air felt colder. My water bottle was almost empty, and I realized how long it had been since I had eaten anything. I wanted to turn back, but I couldn't even remember which direction that was anymore. The mud thinned out eventually, but the trail led to a wide clearing I hadn't seen on the map. It looked like an old logging site, with rotting stumps and piles of branches left to decay. The ground was uneven, and the air felt heavier here. I stopped in the middle of the clearing, turning in slow circles, trying to spot any sign of another path out. That was when I saw it again. A figure, just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't close enough for me to see details, but it was standing upright, watching. The stillness of it made my skin crawl. My throat went dry. I blinked once, and it was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would appear again. I ran across the clearing, tripping over branches and slipping on damp earth until I found another trail leading out. My chest burned, and my legs ached, but I didn't stop running until I felt sure I had put some distance between myself and that place. The trail twisted for what felt like forever, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me. My mind kept playing tricks, turning shadows into shapes, making every gust of wind sound like movement. I pushed myself harder, even though my body begged me to rest. Eventually, I spotted something man-made. An old fence, half collapsed, running along one side of the trail. Relief flooded through me, because it meant I was closer to civilization. I followed it until I came to a narrow dirt road, the kind used by park rangers or maintenance trucks. It wasn't the main trail, but it was something. I forced myself to keep walking, even though my legs shook with every step. The sun was nearly gone now, and the woods were slipping into full darkness. I pulled out my phone, flicked on the flashlight, and kept it pointed at the ground in front of me. Every sound felt magnified, every crunch of leaves behind me sending my heart racing. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw lights. Dim at first, then brighter. It was the parking lot where I had started that morning. I stumbled out of the trees, shoes caked in mud, shirt soaked with sweat, and nearly collapsed when I reached my car. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel with shaking hands, staring at the tree line. I kept expecting to see something step out, to follow me all the way. But nothing did. I drove away with my headlights cutting through the dark road, and even miles later, when the forest was far behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched every step of the way. The sound of those footsteps echoed in my head the entire drive home. I never went back to that trail again, and I never will. I woke up earlier than usual that morning, and the air felt heavier than it should have. It was summer, but the kind of summer morning where the sky looked pale and gray instead of bright and blue. I had planned the trip for weeks. I packed everything into my old backpack: water bottles, some snacks, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and my folding knife. I told myself it was just a quick day hike, nothing serious, nothing dangerous. I had gone out alone many times before, and I knew the trails well enough. The trailhead was quiet when I got there. My car was the only one in the dirt lot, which I thought was odd. Normally there were a few other cars, especially on weekends. I checked the time. It was barely past 8 in the morning. Maybe I was just early. The silence had a weight to it, though, like the woods were holding their breath. The forest spread out in front of me, thick and dark even though the sun was already up. The first stretch of the trail was easy. The dirt was firm, still damp from the rain the night before. I could smell wet leaves and mud, and every step crunched softly under my boots. For a while, I let myself enjoy the quiet. The air was cool, and I felt good moving through the trees. I could hear small birds somewhere high up, and once in a while the leaves shifted like something small was darting away. After maybe an hour, the trail started to climb. I stopped to take a drink and looked back down. From where I stood, I couldn't see the parking lot anymore. Just trees and a slope leading down into more trees. I turned back around and kept going, and that was when I noticed it. The trail ahead didn't look right. There was a faint split, a thin path leading off to the left, narrower and darker than the main one. I had never seen it before. I should have ignored it. I should have stayed on the main trail like I always did, but curiosity got the better of me. The narrow path looked like it had been walked before, but not often. Branches leaned low, and the ground was uneven with roots and rocks. I stepped onto it anyway. The change was immediate. The air seemed cooler, heavier. The trees leaned in tighter, blocking more of the light. My footsteps sounded sharper, and the woods were suddenly too quiet. No bird calls, no rustling. Just the sound of my own breathing and boots hitting the dirt. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe I was just deeper into the forest than usual, but something about it didn't feel right. The trail wound around and dipped down sharply. I followed it longer than I meant to. I told myself I'd turn back after 10 minutes, but I kept walking. Something about the way the trail bent made me feel like I was being led somewhere, and I didn't want to stop until I saw where it went. Eventually, I came into a small clearing. It wasn't much, just an open patch of ground with grass and weeds, surrounded by tall trees. In the middle was an old fire ring made of stones, blackened in the center, as if someone had used it years ago. Beside it, there was a rusted folding chair, the kind you'd see in someone's garage or backyard. It was bent on one side and half buried in the dirt. I don't know why, but the sight of that chair unsettled me more than anything else I had seen. It didn't belong there. There were no campsites on this side of the forest, no official ones anyway. Whoever put it there had dragged it in themselves. It meant someone had been here before, but not recently. The thought of who it might have been, and why they chose this hidden spot, stuck in my head. I crouched down near the fire ring, poking at the ashes with a stick. They were old, damp, and crumbled easily. Whoever had used it hadn't been here for a long time. That should have been comforting, but it wasn't. I felt watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I turned slowly, scanning the trees. They stood still and silent. Nothing moved. I told myself it was time to leave. I stood, brushed the dirt off my hands, and started back the way I came. The trail felt different on the way out. Every sound behind me made me stop and listen. Once I heard something faint like a footstep breaking a stick, but when I turned, nothing was there. I picked up my pace. My heart was beating faster, and I tried to keep calm. The trail twisted, and at one point I realized I had gone farther than I should have without reaching the main path. My chest tightened. I walked faster, then broke into a jog, but the trail kept winding deeper. That was when I saw it, a piece of cloth hanging from a low branch. Faded blue, torn, fluttering slightly in the breeze. I stopped dead. It wasn't mine. I hadn't come this way. My throat went dry, and I realized I had somehow gotten turned around. I was going deeper instead of back out. I forced myself to keep moving, but panic was growing inside me. My legs felt heavy, and every sound made me think someone was following me. The woods pressed in closer, and my sense of direction was gone. At one point, I stumbled into another clearing, smaller than the first, and in the middle of it was a pile of bones. They were small, maybe from a deer or something like that, but they were piled neatly, not scattered. A stack, almost like they had been placed there on purpose. The sight of them froze me where I stood. I wanted to back away slowly, but my body wouldn't move. My skin crawled, and my heart slammed against my ribs. After a long moment, I forced myself to step back. My boot crunched on a stick, loud in the silence, and I swore I heard something shift in the trees. I turned and ran. I didn't care about staying on the path anymore. I just pushed through the brush, branches whipping against my arms and face. My backpack snagged on something, and I yanked it free, stumbling forward. My breath was ragged, and sweat poured down my back. I didn't stop until I crashed through a thicket and stumbled onto the main trail again. I nearly collapsed when I saw it. The wide dirt trail looked like salvation. I stood there for a long time, bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. The woods behind me were silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still back there, standing in the dark, watching. I forced myself to walk, not run, down the main trail toward the lot. My legs shook with every step, and my ears rang with my heartbeat. The closer I got to the edge of the woods, the more the air seemed to lighten. I finally broke out of the trees and saw my car sitting alone in the lot. When I reached it, I threw my backpack inside and sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel, body trembling. I looked back once at the tree line. Nothing moved, but the shadows looked darker than before. I started the car and drove out of there, and I didn't look back again. Even as the road curved away and the forest disappeared behind me, the weight of it stayed in my chest. I knew I had walked into something I shouldn't have. The chair, the ashes, the cloth, the pile of bones, it all meant something. Someone had been there, and maybe they still were. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. At night, when I tried to sleep, I kept imagining footsteps outside my window. My mind replayed the sound of the stick breaking, the shifting in the trees. I hadn't seen anyone, but I didn't need to. I knew what it felt like to be watched. I never went back to that trail again. I told myself I wouldn't hike alone anymore, but the memory never left me. Sometimes when I drive past the forest, I catch myself glancing into the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there waiting. I never do, but I know better now. I know the woods keep secrets, and sometimes you stumble into them without warning. And once you do, a part of you never really leaves. I remember the first time I realized how quickly a calm day could turn into something that grips your entire body with fear. I was out on a weekend hike alone in a remote forested area I had been wanting to explore for months. The trail was supposed to be easy, mostly flat with small inclines, winding through dense patches of oak and pine. The map showed a creek cutting through the middle of the trail, and I had planned to follow it for a while before looping back. I had packed lightly, just a small backpack with water, some snacks, a flashlight, a knife, and a first aid kit. I left my phone in the car. I wanted this to be a real escape from everything. At first, the forest was beautiful. The sunlight filtered through the leaves in scattered, golden patches on the ground, and I could hear birds calling to one another in the distance. The smell of damp earth and pine was strong, but comforting. I moved at a steady pace, stepping carefully over roots and small rocks that jutted out from the path. Every so often, I stopped to look around, noticing the way the light shifted and how the shadows grew longer as the sun climbed higher. The forest felt alive, and I felt entirely alone, but in a way that was calming rather than frightening. After a couple of hours, the trail led me to a small clearing near the creek. I could hear the water trickling over rocks, the sound sharp and clear in the quiet of the forest. I sat on a fallen log, took a sip of water, and rested. I had been hiking for nearly 3 hours, and the solitude was soothing. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened. There was the rush of the water, the rustling of leaves, and something else, something faint that I couldn't immediately identify. It sounded like a heavy, deliberate breathing, not a person's but something larger, more deliberate. I opened my eyes and scanned the clearing. There was nothing, no movement, no signs of any animal, at least not that I could see. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was the wind or maybe my imagination. I packed up and started following the creek, thinking the sound would disappear. It didn't. As I moved along the bank, the breathing grew more distinct. It wasn't constant, but it came in bursts, slow and deep, almost measured, like something was watching and deciding whether to move closer. My first instinct was to slow down, to take a careful look at my surroundings, but I also felt an edge of curiosity. The forest was thick, the trees close together, their trunks wide and covered in moss. Fallen branches crisscrossed the ground, making it uneven. I kept my flashlight in hand, even though it was only mid-afternoon, the canopy overhead making parts of the trail dim and shadowed. I reached a bend in the creek where the water pooled into a small, quiet pond. The air here felt heavier, more stagnant, and the shadows longer. I stopped again, crouching slightly to get a better look around. That's when I noticed the tracks, large, uneven, and not like any animal I had ever seen. They weren't bear tracks, nor were they deer or anything smaller. They were deep, pressing into the mud as if something heavy had been walking on two legs. My stomach turned cold, and I immediately thought about turning back, but the trail looped around the pond, and I wasn't sure which way was safer. The forest seemed different here, denser, quieter, and somehow sharper, like the air was alerting me to something I couldn't yet see. I decided to move slowly along the edge of the pond, keeping my flashlight sweeping over the trees and undergrowth. Every step made the twigs snap under my boots, and every snap echoed far too loudly. I could feel my pulse quicken. The breathing sound was closer now, unmistakably near, and each exhale was slow, heavy, deliberate. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or some other animal, but nothing moved, and the sound didn't come from where a normal animal would. My eyes darted around, searching for movement, but all I saw were shadows, long and jagged, moving in ways that made my chest tighten. Then I saw it, a figure, hunched slightly, moving between the trees on the other side of the pond. It didn't run, it didn't make a noise, but the way it moved was deliberate, purposeful, like it knew exactly where I was. I froze. My body refused to move. My mind raced, trying to think of what it could be. It was larger than a man, but its movements were human-like. I slowly reached into my backpack and touched the knife handle. Not to fight, but to feel like I had some control, some chance. The figure didn't approach the pond. It stayed just on the edge of the shadows, watching. I felt like I was being studied, measured, and I could feel my skin prickle with the awareness of its gaze. I backed away slowly, trying to put more distance between myself and whatever it was. I kept the knife in hand and the flashlight sweeping the forest, trying to keep it illuminated, trying to make it clear that I was aware. The breathing stopped for a moment. Then, a branch snapped far to my left. My head whipped in that direction, but there was nothing, only the thick brush and the dense trees. My instincts screamed at me to run, and I finally obeyed. My boots slipped on the muddy ground near the pond as I broke into a sprint, following the trail that led back the way I had come. The sound of my heartbeat filled my ears, but behind me, I could hear the breathing again, faint at first, then growing louder. It wasn't chasing in a direct line. It was moving through the forest, faster than it should have been able to, keeping pace without breaking into a full run. The trail twisted and turned, the trees pressing closer, the underbrush thickening. Every so often, I stumbled over roots, my flashlight swinging wildly, casting erratic beams of light across the forest. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally in the movement, but I kept going, ignoring the cuts on my hands and legs from the branches. The sound of the breathing was everywhere, surrounding me, pressing in. It wasn't constant. It came and went, but every time it came, it was closer than I expected. After what felt like hours, but was only minutes, I broke into a small clearing where I had parked my car. Relief surged through me, but I didn't slow down. I fumbled with the keys, shaking, mud on my hands, my shirt torn. The figure was not in sight, but I didn't take a chance. I threw the door open, jumped in, and locked it instantly. My flashlight still on, I swept the area around the car. Nothing. No movement, no shadows, no sound. Only the still forest, silent except for the distant trickle of the creek. I started the engine and drove off the trail, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, anything following. The road back to the main highway was long, twisting through more forest, and every so often I would glimpse shadows at the edge of the trees, fleeting, disappearing before I could focus. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. My mind replayed every step I had taken, every sound, every flash of movement. I kept thinking about the tracks by the pond, about the breathing, about the way it had studied me without moving too close. Eventually, I reached the highway. The safety of other cars, of lights, of people, felt overwhelming. I kept driving for miles, refusing to stop until I reached a gas station in a small town, the kind with bright lights and open signs. I parked, leaving the engine running, and went inside to pay for gas and a bottle of water. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see it standing outside, hidden in the shadows. But the lot was empty, the town quiet but normal. People walked past, oblivious, and I could hear cars and voices in the distance. By the time I returned to my car and drove the final stretch home, the fear had subsided into a deep, bone-deep tension, a kind of exhaustion that comes from being aware of something constantly and narrowly escaping it. I unpacked my backpack, cleaned the cuts and scratches, and sat down to try to calm my mind. I realized then that the forest hadn't changed. The trail hadn't changed. Nothing had. But something had followed me, something that moved with a silent intelligence, that knew exactly how to stalk without revealing itself until I was aware. I never went back to that trail. I researched the area and found nothing unusual, no warnings, no reports of dangerous animals or escaped exotic pets. But I know what I saw and heard. I know the way the figure moved, the way it observed me, the way the breathing seemed calculated, almost clinical. And I know that I got lucky, that I escaped. I know now that the forest holds more than beauty and calm. It holds something else, something patient, something aware, and I carry that memory with me every time I step into the woods. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, every shadow stretching in the fading light reminds me of that day, of how fragile the line between safety and danger can be, and how easy it is to be watched without ever seeing what's watching you. Even now, years later, I drive past forests and remember the creek, the pond, the tracks, and that slow, deliberate breathing that almost caught me. And I remember the way the sunlight played through the trees, almost mocking the fear I felt, hiding the shadow that moved just beyond my sight. I never hiked alone in the wild again. I never wanted to feel that uncertainty, that constant edge, that undeniable knowledge that something else is moving, waiting, and calculating every step you take. It changed the way I see the woods, the quiet, the stillness, the peace. Because peace can be an illusion, and the forest never forgets. I remember the first time I went deep into the woods alone. It wasn't planned to be scary, at least not at first. I had been hiking around smaller trails for years, always sticking to paths I knew well. But that day I decided to take a route I hadn't explored. It was early morning, the kind of day when the sun barely reaches the thickest parts of the forest, leaving everything in a soft, gray light. The air was damp and smelled faintly of wet leaves and moss. My pack was heavy with essentials: water, some snacks, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I had no intention of staying overnight. It was just supposed to be a long walk. The trail started normal enough. I could hear birds in the distance and the wind moving through the trees. The path was narrow but clear, lined with ferns and fallen leaves. Every so often, I would hear the snap of a branch or the crunch of leaves behind me, but I assumed it was just animals or the wind. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Birds stopped calling, the wind seemed to die down, and every little sound seemed louder than it should be. Even the sound of my own boots on the trail was deafening. I kept moving, telling myself I was imagining things. After a couple of hours, the path split. One fork seemed wider and flatter, the other narrower and descending into a thick grove of trees. I chose the narrower one. It felt like a shortcut. I was trying to see more of the forest, to feel the isolation and distance from the usual crowded trails. Within minutes, I realized the path wasn't maintained at all. Branches hung low, and the ground was uneven, soaked in mud and rotting leaves. Every step I took sank slightly into the soil. My boots were wet in moments, and I could feel the cold seeping through. I didn't care. I was committed. After another hour, I reached a small clearing. It was almost perfectly circular, surrounded by dense trees on all sides. The sun broke through in a single narrow beam, illuminating a patch of damp grass in the center. Something felt wrong here. The air was heavier, stiller, as if it didn't want to move. The silence was thick. I stopped and listened. At first, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, soft and hesitant. I froze, straining my ears. Then it stopped. Nothing. I told myself it was my imagination, just the wind shifting leaves. I shook my head and kept going. The trail twisted back into the trees and started to descend steeply. My legs were tired, my boots soaked and muddy, and the sky was starting to darken in the thick canopy above. That's when I noticed the sound. It wasn't a branch snapping or a bird calling. It was breathing, heavy, deliberate, slow breaths. I froze. My heart slammed in my chest. The sound was close, coming from behind a clump of trees to my left. I considered running, but the terrain was rough, and I didn't want to fall. I stayed still, listening. The breaths continued, deliberate and low. I could hear them rising and falling, matching some rhythm that felt terrifyingly human. Instinct finally kicked in. I started moving, carefully at first, then faster, trying to put distance between myself and whatever was there. Every step I took on the wet leaves made a loud crunch. I wanted to be silent, but it was impossible. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid it would give me away. I glanced back. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Every shadow looked like it was moving. Every tree trunk seemed to hide a figure. My imagination was probably exaggerating everything, but that didn't matter. My instincts were screaming at me to get out. I found a narrow path leading down to a small creek. The sound of running water was faintly soothing. I followed it, hoping it would lead somewhere familiar. The path was overgrown, but I had to keep moving. I slipped in the mud once, my hand scraping against a tree bark and leaving a sting. I wiped it quickly and kept going. The light was fading fast, and I realized I was far deeper in the forest than I had intended. The sense of isolation was suffocating. Every step forward felt like a gamble. Then I heard something else. Not breathing, not footsteps, but a low growl. It was muffled, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the creek. My stomach dropped. I had never been a big fan of wild animals, and I knew there could be bears, mountain lions, or even wolves in this region. My first thought was to find a place to climb or hide, but there were no trees big enough, and the ground was too uneven. I was stuck between the creek and whatever was out there. My mind raced. I knew running blindly could get me hurt or attract the animal. Staying still seemed almost worse. I remembered the flashlight in my pack. I pulled it out, fumbling to turn it on. The beam cut a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating the creek and the muddy banks. I scanned the area carefully. At first, nothing moved. Then I saw it, a large shadow, crouched low, moving slowly along the edge of the trees. It wasn't running, just watching, tracking. My heart froze. It didn't attack immediately, just followed my movements. I tried to stay calm, taking slow steps backward along the creek. The mud made it difficult, and every movement made a wet squelch sound that seemed deafening in the silence. I realized I needed to leave the forest completely before night fell. I knew the main trail wasn't far from here. I had seen it on the map. I turned carefully, keeping my flashlight low, and started walking along the creek's edge, hoping the shadow wouldn't follow me across the water. The mud was worse than I thought. Every few steps I slipped, catching myself with the pack strap or my hands on the grass. My legs were shaking from fear and exhaustion. The sound of breathing, or growling, never left me. It was always just behind the trees, always keeping pace, but never making a full attack. After what felt like hours, though it was probably closer to 40 minutes, I saw something I recognized, a large boulder near a bend in the creek that marked the edge of the main trail. Relief washed over me. I broke into a run, slipping and sliding through the mud, barely caring about my soaked clothes or scraped hands. The shadow didn't follow this time. I didn't look back. I just ran until the forest thinned and I reached the trail. Familiar markers, the jagged bark of an old oak, the split log I had passed earlier, gave me confirmation I was back on known ground. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My boots were caked in mud, my shirt torn, and my hands scratched, but I didn't care. I locked the doors and sat inside, trying to catch my breath. The headlights illuminated the path behind me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the tree line, but when I blinked it was gone. I drove home slowly, staying on main roads and avoiding any shortcuts. I didn't speak to anyone, didn't call anyone. I just needed to be out of the forest completely. That night, I unpacked my bag, washed the mud from my hands and face, and looked at the scratches along my arms. It could have been worse, far worse. I realized how close I had come to being trapped, or worse, attacked. I had underestimated the woods, underestimated how alone you can feel even when you're prepared. There was no fantasy, no ghost, no fairy tale monster. Just me and something that shouldn't have been there, watching, tracking. And sometimes that's worse than any made-up fear, because it's real, it's dangerous, and it can happen to anyone who thinks they know the forest. The next day, I returned to the trail, this time with a friend. We went only a short distance, taking marked paths and staying near open areas. I told myself I had to confront it in some way, to not let the fear take over completely. The woods felt different with someone else there. Every noise wasn't a threat. The trees were no longer menacing. But the memory stayed, the heavy breathing, the low growl, the shadow following me silently along the creek. It stayed with me for weeks, reminding me of how easy it is to get lost, to be watched, and how quickly a hike can turn into something terrifying. Even months later, I still check my backpack before heading into any trail. I carry extra tools, water, and make sure someone knows exactly where I am. The memory hasn't faded, and I don't think it ever will. But I survived, and that made it clear. Fear is manageable when you respect the forest, pay attention, and never assume you're completely alone, even when it feels like you are. Every leaf, every shadow, every sound can matter. And sometimes, being careful is the difference between returning home safely and becoming just another story that no one hears.